The headlights of my Ford pickup swept across the driveway as I pulled in around 11 that Thursday night in October. I'd been putting in overtime at the warehouse for weeks, trying to save up enough to finally fix the roof before winter hit Colorado Springs hard. My wife Diane had taken the kids to her mother's place in Denver for the week, something about needing space to think about our marriage, which left me alone in that old 2-story house my father had left me when he passed in 2014. The silence in the empty house had been getting to me lately, so I'd been staying late at work just to avoid it. As I cut the engine and grabbed my thermos from the passenger seat, movement in my peripheral vision made me pause. Someone was standing at the edge of my driveway, perfectly still, just watching my house like they were studying it for a test. It took me a second to recognize him in the darkness, but when I did, my whole body tensed up like I'd touched a live wire. Craig Novak, my next-door neighbor from before everything went to hell, was standing there in a worn denim jacket and jeans that hung loose on his frame. Prison had taken at least 30 pounds off him, and his hair, which used to be this wild mane he was so proud of, was now buzz-cut short and gray at the temples. He must have gotten out recently because I hadn't seen him around, and trust me, I would have noticed. The last time I'd seen Craig was 7 years ago when they loaded him into the police car after what he did. That night changed everything for my family. My dad never fully recovered from the head injury Craig gave him with that baseball bat during his drunken rampage, and watching him deteriorate over the following years, until his death was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to endure. I stayed in the truck for a moment, keys in my fist, debating whether to just back out and drive somewhere else until he left. But this was my house, my property, and I wasn't going to let him intimidate me on my own land. When I stepped out, Craig raised both hands in this slow, deliberate way, palms facing me like he was trying to calm a spooked horse. The porch light from his house cast these long shadows across his face, making the hollows under his cheekbones look deeper than they probably were. He'd always been a big guy, the kind who used his size to get his way in arguments. But now there was something different about how he carried himself, like he was trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. The October wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the asphalt between us, and I could smell cigarette smoke and something else on him, maybe cheap cologne trying to mask something worse. Craig took a step forward, still keeping his hands visible, and his voice came out rougher than I remembered, like he'd been gargling gravel. He said he'd been out for 3 weeks, staying at a halfway house downtown at first, but he'd moved back into his old place just yesterday because his mother had kept up the payments while he was gone. The old woman had died 2 years into his sentence, he told me, but she'd made sure he had somewhere to come back to. He kept talking, saying he'd found God inside, that he was in AA now, that he understood what he'd taken from me and my family. Every word sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror 100 times. He wanted to make amends, he said, part of his 12-step program, and he pulled out this crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket, holding it out to me like it was supposed to mean something. I didn't move to take it, just stood there with my truck door still open behind me, ready to bolt if necessary. The paper fluttered in his hand as the wind picked up again, and I could see writing on it, probably some letter his sponsor made him write or something. Craig's eyes kept darting between my face and the ground, never quite settling on either, and there was this twitch in his left cheek that hadn't been there before. When I didn't take the paper, he slowly lowered his hand and shoved it back in his pocket, but he didn't leave. Instead, he started talking about my dad, about how he remembered him working on cars in the garage on weekends, how he used to wave when Craig jogged by in the mornings before everything went bad. He said my father was a good man who didn't deserve what happened, and that he thought about that night every single day in his cell. The streetlight buzzed overhead, casting this sickly orange glow over everything, and I noticed Craig's knuckles were scarred in ways they hadn't been before, covered in these white lines that looked like a roadmap of violence. I finally found my voice and told him to get off my property, that whatever program he was working didn't require my participation or forgiveness. My words came out steadier than I felt, but my jaw was clenched so tight I could hear my teeth grinding. Craig nodded like he'd expected this, backing away with his hand still raised, saying he understood, that he'd be next door if I ever wanted to talk. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. He mentioned he'd noticed my tool shed door had been open earlier that day when he was moving boxes in, and he'd closed it for me to keep animals out. I hadn't been home all day, and I always locked that shed because that's where I kept my father's tools, the ones he'd collected over 40 years of working construction. The thought of Craig anywhere near those tools, touching things that belonged to my dad, made me want to put my fist through something. After he disappeared into his house, I went straight to the shed with my phone flashlight, my breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air. The padlock was still there, locked like I'd left it that morning, but when I opened it and stepped inside, something was wrong. The tools were all there, hanging on their designated hooks just like my father had organized them. But his favorite hammer, the Estwing with the leather-wrapped handle he'd bought in 1975, was on the workbench instead of its hook. A thin layer of dust on the bench showed the outline where it had been placed recently. My father never left tools out, and neither did I. It was like muscle memory to put everything back exactly where it belonged. I picked up the hammer, feeling its familiar weight, and noticed something else. There were fresh scratches on the wooden handle, like someone had been gripping it too tight or maybe practicing swinging it. The next few days passed in this weird state of hypervigilance where I found myself checking locks twice, 3 times, before leaving for work. I installed a cheap security camera from Walmart, one of those that sends alerts to your phone, pointing it at the shed and driveway. Craig kept his distance, but I'd see him sometimes through the kitchen window, sitting on his porch smoking cigarettes and staring at nothing, or at least pretending to. Then things started disappearing. First, it was small stuff I could almost explain away. The garden hose nozzle I knew I'd left attached was gone, then showed up 2 days later, hanging on Craig's fence like it had been there all along. A pair of work gloves vanished from my truck bed, then appeared stuffed in my mailbox, damp with morning dew. Each time I thought about confronting him, but what would I say? That I was pretty sure he was stealing things just to return them. The police would laugh me out of the station. The security camera started picking up movement at night, but never anything definitive. Just shadows at the edge of its range, or sometimes a blur that could have been a cat or raccoon. But one night around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the notification sound and checked my phone to see Craig standing in my driveway, completely still, facing my house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there in pajama pants and a white t-shirt, barefoot despite the near-freezing temperature. I watched him through the live feed for 20 minutes and he never moved once, not even to shift his weight. His eyes were open but unfocused, and for a moment I wondered if he was sleepwalking. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, he turned and walked back to his house, moving normally like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, just sat in my living room with my father's old shotgun across my lap, watching the windows. I called Diane the next morning, trying to keep my voice casual as I told her maybe she should stay at her mother's a bit longer. She asked if everything was all right, and I could hear the concern creeping into her voice, but I just said work was crazy, and I didn't want the kids to see me so stressed. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. How could I explain that our ex-con neighbor was playing some psychological game that I couldn't quite prove? The night after that phone call, my motion sensor lights kept triggering, one after another in sequence, like someone was walking circles around my house. Front porch, side yard, back deck, other side, then front porch again. Each time I looked out, nobody was there, but I could smell cigarette smoke through the cracked window, that same brand Craig had been chain smoking on his porch. The camera only showed empty yards and swaying shadows from the trees, but those lights didn't trigger from wind. Then came that Saturday morning. I'd actually managed to sleep for a few hours, exhaustion finally overwhelming paranoia, when I heard something scratching at the front door. Not knocking, scratching like a dog wanting to be let in. When I looked through the peephole, nobody was there, but there was something white on the porch. I grabbed the shotgun, checked through all the windows to make sure Craig wasn't lurking nearby, then cracked the door open. It was a piece of notebook paper, folded once, weighted down with a rock from my own garden. My mouth went dry as I picked it up and read the single line written in pencil, the handwriting shaky like someone had written it with their non-dominant hand. I still remember that night too. That's all it said, but it was enough to make my knees weak. Because Craig had been blackout drunk that night 7 years ago. So drunk he claimed in court, he didn't remember anything about attacking my father. His whole defense had been built on that claim, that he had no memory of breaking down our back door and coming after my dad with the bat from my own garage. I went straight to Craig's house, not even bothering to put on shoes, pounding on his door hard enough to shake the frame. When he answered, he looked genuinely confused, his hair sticking up at odd angles like he'd just woken up. He was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and wearing reading glasses I'd never seen before, looking for all the world like any harmless middle-aged man on a Saturday morning. When I shoved the note in his face demanding to know what kind of sick game he was playing, he squinted at it, then looked back at me with what seemed like real bewilderment. He swore he didn't write it, said he'd been at his AA meeting until late last night and had his sponsor's number if I wanted to verify. He even offered to show me his notebook where he kept his step work, holding it out with hands that weren't shaking at all. The handwriting in his notebook was completely different, neat and precise where the note's writing was chaotic. But when he reached for the note to look at it closer, I saw something that made everything else fade away. Under his fingernails there was dust, the same distinctive reddish construction dust that covered everything in my father's tool shed. I backed away from his door without saying another word, my mind racing faster than my feet as I crossed back to my property. Craig called after me, asking what was wrong, still playing his innocent act. But I didn't turn around. Inside my house, I called my old friend Tom, who worked for the sheriff's department, told him everything that had been happening, including the dust under Craig's nails. Tom listened without interrupting, then said something that changed everything. There had been 3 other reports in the past 2 weeks from families in the neighborhood, all describing similar experiences with items being moved, notes being left, someone standing in their yards at night. The thing was, Craig had solid alibis for all of those incidents, verified by multiple witnesses at his halfway house or AA meetings. Tom asked me to check something, to look for any medications in my bathroom that might have been moved or tampered with. That's when I found it. My prescription sleep medication that I'd stopped taking months ago was nearly empty when it should have been almost full. Tom came by that afternoon with another detective, and they found something I'd never have thought to look for. There were small holes drilled in the fence between Craig's yard and mine, painted over to match the wood, but positioned perfectly to watch my house from his bedroom window. They also found a journal in Craig's room, hidden inside an old heating vent, where he'd documented everything about our family for years before he went to prison, including detailed observations about my father's routines, my work schedule, even notes about which lights we left on at night. The really sick part was that he'd been planning this since before he got out, had written about how he was going to make me understand what it felt like to lose someone slowly, to watch them deteriorate like my father had. But he'd been smart about it, making sure he had alibis, probably using the sleep medication he'd been stealing to make sure I'd be groggy enough not to catch him. The dust under his nails was his only mistake, probably from his last visit to the shed that morning before I confronted him. They arrested Craig that evening for criminal harassment, breaking and entering, and theft of prescription medication. As they led him to the police car, he didn't say a word, just stared at me with this blank expression that was somehow worse than anger would have been. His lawyer got him a plea deal for 2 years with mandatory psychiatric treatment, which seemed like nothing compared to what he'd put me through. But at least it got him away from my family. I changed all the locks, installed a real security system, and patched every one of those holes in the fence myself. Diane and the kids came home the following week, and I told her everything, showed her the police reports and the photos of Craig's journal. She held me for a long time that night, both of us realizing how much worse it could have been if I hadn't noticed that dust under his fingernails. The house feels different now, even with Craig gone. Sometimes I still check the locks 3 times before bed, and I replaced every tool in that shed. Couldn't stand touching the ones he'd handled. But the worst part is knowing he'll get out again someday, and that journal showed he's patient enough to wait years for his revenge. Tom told me Craig's obsession started because my father had called the cops on him once for a domestic dispute years before the attack, something I never even knew about. Such a small thing that led to all of this. I'd been teaching Diane how to use the security system and bought her pepper spray for her keychain. We're thinking about moving, maybe somewhere across town or even out of state. But for now, we're taking it one day at a time. At least now I know I wasn't losing my mind, that every instinct telling me something was wrong had been right. Sometimes that's all you can hold on to, the knowledge that you trusted yourself when it mattered most. The cardboard boxes were still stacked against the living room wall when Brandon first knocked on our door that September afternoon. My roommate Kevin and I had just signed the lease 3 days earlier, desperate to find something affordable after our previous landlord decided to sell. The place on Willow Court wasn't much to look at, just a standard 2-bedroom in a complex built sometime during the Reagan administration, but the rent was manageable and it was only 20 minutes from both our jobs. Kevin answered the door while I was untangling Ethernet cables, and I heard this overly enthusiastic voice introducing himself as our across-the-hall neighbor. When I walked over to say hello, Brandon was holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, grinning like we were long-lost relatives at a family reunion. He was probably mid-40s, wearing a polo shirt tucked into khakis that looked like they'd been ironed with military precision, and he had this way of maintaining eye contact for just a beat too long. Kevin and I exchanged glances while Brandon launched into a detailed history of every tenant who'd lived in our unit for the past 6 years. He knew their names, their jobs, where they'd moved afterward, even what kind of car the previous couple drove. The casserole dish grew heavy in his hands as he talked, but he never set it down, just kept holding it out like an offering, while describing how quiet the building usually was, how the mail carrier came at exactly 2:15 every day except Sundays, how the dumpsters got emptied on Wednesdays at 6 in the morning sharp. When he finally handed over the casserole and left, Kevin immediately Googled whether you could hide cameras in food. We laughed about it then, joking that we'd already found the complex's resident weirdo. The casserole was actually pretty good, some kind of chicken and rice thing with too much cheese, and we figured Brandon was just lonely. Lots of single middle-aged guys get awkward around people, especially younger folks who remind them of what they used to be. Neither of us touched the second casserole he brought the next day. The gifts started appearing about a week later. First, it was a 6-pack of craft beer left on our doormat with a sticky note that said, "Noticed you guys carrying Sierra Nevada upstairs. Thought you might enjoy these." The thing was, we'd carried those beers up at 11:30 at night after a late grocery run. Then came the magazine subscriptions we never ordered, all addressed to us, but clearly paid for by someone else. Sports Illustrated for Kevin because Brandon had seen him wearing a Lakers jersey once. Wired for me after he'd spotted an old Arduino kit through our window when the blinds were cracked. Each gift came with these little notes demonstrating just how much attention he was paying to our daily routines. He knew Kevin left for his shift at the hospital at 6:45 each morning. He knew I worked from home on Fridays and always ordered Thai food from the place on Riverside Drive. The notes were always cheerful, always signed with a smiley face, always written in this perfect elementary school teacher handwriting that made my neck tense up. Kevin started keeping a log after Brandon showed up at his gym across town. Not the community center 5 minutes away, not the Planet Fitness by the grocery store, but the specific CrossFit box in Northside where Kevin had been going for months before we moved. Brandon claimed it was pure coincidence, said his cousin had recommended the place, but he somehow ended up in Kevin's same morning class 3 days in a row. He'd position himself at the next station during circuits, offering form tips and asking about Kevin's workout history, his diet, whether I ever joined him for sessions. The owner told Kevin that Brandon had specifically asked about the schedule for the tall black guy who drives the blue Mazda before signing up for a membership. That same week, I ran into Brandon at the coffee shop where I sometimes worked in the afternoons when the apartment got too stuffy. He walked in carrying a laptop I'd never seen him use before, acted surprised to see me there, then sat at the table directly behind mine for 3 hours without ordering anything after his initial coffee. We decided to talk to the property manager after the laundry room incident. It was a Monday night, close to 2 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep because of a project deadline. I figured I'd throw in a load of clothes since no one else would be using the machines at that hour. The laundry room was in the basement, lit by these harsh fluorescent tubes that made everything look greenish, and you had to walk past the storage units to get there. I was loading quarters into the washer when I heard breathing behind me. Brandon was standing in the doorway wearing pajama pants and a white undershirt, holding an empty laundry basket. No detergent, no clothes, just the basket pressed against his stomach. He said he couldn't sleep either, asked if I wanted company while my clothes washed. When I said I was heading right back upstairs, he mentioned that Kevin had seemed stressed lately, wondered if we were having roommate problems, if maybe I needed someone to talk to about it. The whole time he was blocking the doorway, not aggressively, just standing there like he'd forgotten how doorways worked. I had to say excuse me 3 times before he stepped aside. The property manager, Nancy, acted like we were overreacting until we showed her Kevin's log. 3 pages of dates and times. Brandon appearing at the mailboxes whenever we checked mail. Brandon carrying groceries to his door at the exact moment we'd come home from shopping. Brandon taking out trash that couldn't have been full because he'd emptied it 12 hours earlier. Nancy's expression changed when she read about the gym and the coffee shop. She said she'd talk to him, give him a warning about respecting boundaries. 2 days later, Brandon knocked on our door to apologize. He brought homemade cookies this time, chocolate chip with walnuts, and his apology was so detailed it became its own form of harassment. He apologized for making us uncomfortable at the gym, at the coffee shop, in the laundry room at 2:18 in the morning on Monday. He knew the exact times, the exact locations, even mentioned things we hadn't told Nancy about, like how he'd accidentally walked behind me to my car after work the previous Friday, or how he'd happened to be at the same gas station Kevin used on Sunday mornings. Each apology contained information that proved he was still watching, still cataloging our movements, still treating our lives like a TV show he couldn't stop binging. Things went quiet for about a week after that. Brandon stopped appearing everywhere, stopped leaving gifts, even seemed to avoid eye contact when we passed in the hallway. Kevin thought maybe Nancy's warning had actually worked, but I kept feeling this weight in my chest whenever I came home. The silence felt intentional, calculated, like when a storm suddenly stops and you know something worse is coming. Then Kevin noticed his bike had been moved in the storage room. Not stolen, just shifted 3 spaces over from where he'd locked it. The chain wrapped differently than he always did it. I found a receipt from a hardware store tucked under my windshield wiper one morning, paid in cash, for items I couldn't quite make out because the ink was smudged. The timestamp showed it was purchased at 3:47 in the morning. We started finding these little signs that someone had been in spaces we thought were ours. A window we never opened was cracked 1/2 inch. The welcome mat was turned at a different angle. Kevin's laundry detergent was fuller than it should have been, like someone had added more to it. We installed a doorbell camera without telling Nancy. Figured we needed proof before anyone would take us seriously. The first few nights showed nothing unusual, just us coming and going. The occasional delivery driver, a few other tenants passing by. But on the 4th night, the motion sensor triggered at 3:22 in the morning. Brandon was standing directly in front of our door, not moving, not knocking, just standing there facing the door like he was listening. He stayed for exactly 12 minutes, then walked back to his apartment. The next night, 3:22 again, 14 minutes this time. He never looked at the camera, kept his head tilted slightly down, but we could see his lips moving like he was having a conversation. Kevin wanted to call the police right then, but I convinced him to wait until we had more footage. We needed them to understand this wasn't just a neighbor being friendly or confused. The 3rd night, Brandon showed up with something in his hand. He knelt down and slipped what looked like a folded piece of paper under our door, then stood up and pressed his palm flat against the door for almost 30 seconds before walking away. The paper was a printed screenshot of Kevin's Instagram story from 2 years ago, before we'd even met each other, before either of us had heard of Willow Court. It showed Kevin at some beach in California with friends, and someone had drawn red circles around everyone's faces except Kevin's. On the back, in that same perfect handwriting, it said, "They don't deserve you." We found 4 more papers throughout the day, slipped into places Brandon shouldn't have been able to access. One in Kevin's gym bag that had been locked in his car. One inside my laptop case in the apartment. One folded into the exact middle page of a book I was reading. The last one was in our freezer, wrapped in plastic, placed between 2 boxes of frozen vegetables we'd bought the day before. That one was a photo of me from high school that I'd never posted online, standing in front of my parents' house in Ohio. I hadn't been back there in 7 years. The only copy of that photo existed in an album my mom kept in her basement. Kevin called the police while I threw up in the bathroom, my whole body shuddering as I tried to figure out how Brandon could have gotten that picture. The officers who came seemed skeptical, until we showed them the doorbell footage and the photos. They took our statements, looked at Kevin's log, said they'd go talk to Brandon. We watched through the peephole as they knocked on his door across the hall. No answer. They knocked again, announced themselves, waited. After 10 minutes, they told us Brandon wasn't home and they'd try again later. But 20 minutes after the police left, we heard Brandon's door open and close. He'd been in there the whole time, just refusing to answer. That night, neither of us slept. We pushed the couch against the door and took turns staying awake. Kevin with a baseball bat he'd bought that afternoon, me with my phone ready to call 911. Around 4 in the morning, we heard footsteps in the hallway that stopped right outside our door. The doorbell camera alert went off on my phone. Brandon was back, but this time he was holding something up to the peephole. It was another photo, this one of Kevin and me inside our apartment, taken from a high angle like it was shot from the ceiling, showing us watching TV on the couch just 2 nights earlier. Kevin lost it. He yanked the couch away from the door and stormed into the hallway, but Brandon was already gone. That's when Kevin looked up at the smoke detector mounted between our door and Brandon's. Something seemed wrong about it. The LED light that usually blinked green was dark, and the casing looked slightly newer than the one further down the hall. Kevin grabbed a stepladder from our apartment and climbed up while I held it steady. When he popped open the detector's cover, a small camera fell out and dangled by its wire. Not just a basic camera either, but something sophisticated with night vision capabilities and a wide-angle lens. We checked the other detector near the stairwell and found another one. These weren't just watching our door. They were angled to see through the gap under it when we opened it, to catch glimpses inside our apartment. Kevin called 911 while I ran to Nancy's unit and pounded on her door until she answered in her robe. The police arrived within minutes this time, and Nancy used her master key to open Brandon's apartment when he wouldn't respond. The place was empty. Not just that he wasn't home, but completely empty. No furniture, no clothes, nothing except hundreds of photos taped to every wall. The photos covered 3 years of Kevin's life and 18 months of mine, long before we'd moved to Willow Court. Pictures from grocery stores, from previous apartments, from family gatherings we'd attended in different states. There were detailed notes written directly on the walls in permanent marker, documenting our routines, our preferences, our relationships. One wall was dedicated entirely to analyzing Kevin's workout schedule and dietary habits. Another mapped out my work patterns and coffee shop visits across 3 different cities I'd lived in. The police found Brandon's real name was Aaron Fitzgerald, and he'd been renting the apartment for 4 years, going through tenant after tenant, selecting certain ones to document. They found external hard drives with thousands of hours of footage from the smoke detector cameras and others he'd hidden in the laundry room vents and stairwell emergency lights. Nancy broke down crying when she realized he'd been doing this under her watch. We stayed in a hotel that night while the police processed the scene. They arrested Aaron 2 days later at a storage facility 40 miles away, where he'd been living in a modified unit, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from cameras he'd installed in 2 other apartment complexes. We moved out before the week ended, broke our lease without penalty, and found a house to rent on the other side of the city. Sometimes I still check doorways twice and look up at smoke detectors longer than I should, but at least now when someone knocks on our door with cookies, it's just a neighbor being friendly. The divorce had been finalized just after my 31st birthday, and finding an affordable place in a decent school district felt like winning the lottery. My daughter Lily was 7, still young enough to think moving was an adventure, and she'd spent the first week in our new house exploring every corner while I unpacked boxes. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet streets lined with oak trees, kids riding bikes after school, the kind of place where people actually waved when they passed you on the sidewalk. Our next-door neighbor, an older man named Harold, had introduced himself the day we moved in, bringing over a casserole dish and telling me how nice it was to have a family in the neighborhood again. Harold must have been in his 70s, thin and stooped with age, always wearing the same beige cardigan no matter the weather. He lived alone in the house to our right, kept his lawn immaculate, and seemed to spend most of his time tending to his garden or sitting on his porch with his orange tabby cat. At first, I appreciated having a friendly neighbor, especially one who seemed so harmless and grandfatherly. He'd wave from his porch when Lily played in the yard, sometimes calling out compliments about what a well-behaved child she was, how lucky I was to have such a sweet little girl. I'd smile and wave back, grateful that at least one person in this new place had made us feel welcome. The interaction started small, innocent enough that I barely noticed the pattern forming. Harold would appear at the fence whenever Lily was outside, holding a plate of homemade sugar cookies, the kind with pink frosting and sprinkles that kids go crazy for. He'd lean over the chain-link fence separating our yards, his weathered hands gripping the metal, calling out to her in that raspy voice of his. Lily would run over, delighted by the attention and treats, while I watched from the kitchen window, telling myself this was just what neighbors did in places like this. He started mentioning his cat, Whiskers, saying how lonely the poor thing got during the day, wondering if maybe Lily would like to come over sometime and keep him company. Then came the toys, little things at first. A rubber ball that had supposedly rolled into his yard months ago. A set of colored pencils he claimed to have found while cleaning his garage. Each time he'd wait until I was inside or distracted, approaching Lily directly with these gifts, always with a story about why she should have them. One afternoon, I came outside to find him teaching her how to make a cat's cradle with string, their heads bent close together, his fingers guiding hers through the patterns. The sight made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. Watching this old man's hands touching my daughter's, even for something as innocent as a string game. When I called Lily inside, Harold straightened up slowly, that permanent smile of his never wavering, and mentioned he'd be going out of town soon, wondering if Lily might want to feed Whiskers while he was gone. That evening, after Lily was in bed, I sat at my laptop with a glass of wine, telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting the stress of the divorce and the move turn me into one of those helicopter parents. But my fingers typed his name into the search bar anyway, Harold Garrison, along with our street address. The first few results were nothing, some mentions in local gardening club newsletters, a photo from a community barbecue 5 years ago. But then I found it. Buried on the third page of results, a news article from 2018 about complaints filed against a Harold Garrison in a neighboring county. The details were vague. Something about inappropriate behavior around minors at a public pool, charges that were dropped when witnesses failed to appear in court. My mouth went dry as I clicked through to another link, a community forum post warning about an elderly man matching Harold's description who'd been seen taking photos of children at a playground. I spent the next hour digging deeper, finding fragments of information that painted an increasingly unsettling picture. There were 2 more incidents. One from 2016 where he'd been asked to leave a youth center after parents complained about him offering to give swimming lessons to young girls. Another from just last year where police had questioned him about loitering near an elementary school. Nothing had ever stuck. No convictions, no registered offender status, just a trail of complaints and suspicions that followed him from town to town. The wine glass sat forgotten beside me as I stared at the screen, my mind racing through every interaction he'd had with Lily, every cookie, every toy, every moment I'd left them alone together even for a second. The string game kept replaying in my head, his spotted hands manipulating the yarn around my daughter's small fingers, and I had to run to the bathroom, my stomach churning with a mixture of fear and rage. After splashing cold water on my face, I went to check on Lily, needing to see her safe in her bed, her stuffed elephant clutched to her chest, breathing steadily in the glow of her nightlight. I pulled her door nearly closed and went to every window in the house, checking locks, pulling curtains tight, my heart hammering against my ribs. From the kitchen window, I could see Harold's house, dark except for a single light in what I assumed was his living room. As I watched, the curtain moved slightly, and I jerked back, even though I knew he couldn't possibly see me in the darkened kitchen. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my contacts, wondering who I could call, what I could say. The police would want evidence, something more than old complaints and dropped charges, and I had nothing concrete, just a mother's instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. Sleep was impossible that night, every small sound making me jump, every car passing on the street sending me to peek through the blinds. Around 2 a.m, I heard a door close softly, and when I crept to the front window, I saw Harold's porch light on, though I couldn't see him anywhere. I stood there for 20 minutes watching, waiting, until finally the light clicked off and everything went quiet again. The next morning, I kept Lily inside despite the beautiful weather, making up excuses about needing her help with organizing her room. Harold appeared in his garden around 10, pruning his roses with methodical precision, occasionally glancing toward our house. When Lily asked if she could go outside and play, I told her maybe later, my voice too bright, too forced, and she gave me that look kids get when they know something's wrong, but adults won't explain what. The day dragged on with painful slowness, Lily growing increasingly restless and cranky from being cooped up inside. I tried to distract her with movies and baking projects, but my attention kept drifting to the windows, checking if Harold was still out there. He seemed to be finding every possible reason to stay in his front yard, sweeping his already spotless walkway, adjusting his garden hose, trimming bushes that didn't need trimming. Around 4 p.m, he knocked on our door, and I watched through the peephole as he stood there holding a plate covered in aluminum foil, that same benign smile plastered on his face. I didn't answer, holding my breath, one hand pressed against Lily's mouth when she started to ask who was at the door. He knocked again, waited, then finally left the plate on our doorstep and shuffled back to his house. Later, when I was sure he'd gone inside, I quickly grabbed the plate and threw it directly in the garbage, cookies and all. As evening approached, I made dinner while Lily colored at the kitchen table, her mood improved by the promise of ice cream for dessert if she ate all her vegetables. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when movement outside caught my eye. Harold was standing on the sidewalk directly across from our house, not on his property, not walking anywhere, just standing there facing our front door. He wasn't doing anything threatening, technically, just standing on a public sidewalk, but the deliberateness of it, the way he positioned himself with a clear view of our entrance, made my skin prickle with alarm. I pulled out my phone and started recording through the kitchen window, needing some kind of proof, some documentation of this behavior. He stood there for 43 minutes. I know because I filmed the entire time, my phone growing hot in my grip, until finally a couple walking their dog approached and he turned, walking slowly back toward his house, as if he'd just been out for an evening stroll. That night, after triple-checking every lock and moving a chair against the front door, I called my ex-husband, something I'd sworn I wouldn't do unless it was an absolute emergency. I explained everything, The research I'd found, the standing and watching, how Harold seemed to be escalating his interest in Lily. My ex listened, then said what I knew he would say, that without concrete evidence, without Harold actually doing something illegal, there wasn't much anyone could do. He suggested I install security cameras, maybe talk to other neighbors, see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. After we hung up, I sat in Lily's doorway watching her sleep, my laptop open as I ordered cameras for next day delivery, along with new deadbolts and window locks. I dozed off there sometime after 3, waking with a stiff neck when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that just said, "She looked lovely in her pink pajamas yesterday." My entire body went rigid as I read the message again, then looked down at Lily, who was indeed wearing her pink unicorn pajamas, the same ones she'd worn yesterday morning when I'd let her grab the newspaper from the porch. I screenshotted the message, my fingers trembling as I called 911, finally having something concrete to report. The police arrived within 15 minutes, 2 officers who took my statement and looked at all the evidence I'd gathered. They went next door to talk to Harold, and I watched from my window as he answered his door in his bathrobe, looking confused and frail, shaking his head repeatedly. When they came back, they told me he claimed to know nothing about any text message, that he didn't even own a cell phone, just his landline. They said they'd file a report, suggested I keep documenting everything, and mentioned I might want to consider a restraining order, though without proof he'd sent the message, it would be difficult to obtain. After they left, I packed 2 suitcases, grabbed Lily, still in her pajamas, and drove to my sister's house 3 hours away, leaving the cameras and locks in their delivery boxes on the porch, deciding that no house, no matter how perfect the neighborhood seemed, was worth risking my daughter's safety. We stayed at my sister's for 2 weeks while I figured out what to do, eventually breaking my lease and finding a new place in a gated apartment complex with security and key fob access, somewhere Harold couldn't just wander by. I had to explain to Lily why we moved so suddenly, settling on a version of the truth that wouldn't terrify her. Just that sometimes grown-ups don't make good choices about boundaries, and we needed to live somewhere with better rules. The property management company forwarded me mail for a while, mostly junk and bills, but one day there was a hand-addressed envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, taken from a distance but clearly showing Lily on our old porch in those pink pajamas reaching for the newspaper. On the back, in spidery handwriting, it said, "Such a shame you had to leave." I took it straight to the police station, added it to the file, but nothing ever came of it. They increased patrols in the old neighborhood for a while, but Harold never did anything else they could arrest him for. 6 months later, I got a call from our old neighbor across the street, a woman named Beth who I'd only spoken to once or twice. She'd found my number through the property management company, wanted to let me know that Harold had been arrested. Not for anything involving children, but for breaking into another neighbor's house while they were on vacation, apparently looking for something, though nobody could figure out what. When they searched his house, they found boxes of photographs, hundreds of them, all of children from the neighborhood spanning back years, pictures taken from bushes, through windows, from his car. They found pictures of Lily, dozens of them, including ones from inside our house that he must have taken through windows when we weren't paying attention. Beth said the detective wanted my contact information, that they were building a bigger case now, connecting him to incidents in 3 different states. I hung up and held Lily extra tight that night, grateful for my instincts, for running when every logical part of me said I was overreacting. Harold got 15 years, not nearly enough, but at least he was finally behind bars where he couldn't watch anyone's daughter through their kitchen window, couldn't stand on sidewalks planning God knows what. After splashing cold water on my face, I checked on Lily, watching her sleep peacefully with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, completely unaware of the danger living 20 feet away. I pulled her bedroom curtains closed, making sure they overlapped completely, then went through the house doing the same with every window that faced Harold's property. My phone buzzed with a text from my ex-husband asking about weekend plans, but I couldn't focus on anything except the old man next door and what I should do about him. Calling the police seemed pointless. What would I say? That my neighbor gave my daughter cookies and had some old allegations that never went anywhere. I knew how that would sound, like a hysterical single mother making drama out of nothing. But I also knew what I'd found, and more importantly, I knew that gut feeling I'd been ignoring, that primitive maternal instinct that had been screaming at me every time Harold looked at my daughter. The decision to keep Lily inside the next day led to the kind of tantrum only a 7-year-old denied her outdoor time could produce. She pressed her face against the living room window, whining about wanting to ride her bike, to play hopscotch, to do anything other than watch cartoons and color. Around noon, Harold knocked on our door, holding a plate covered in aluminum foil, his excuse being that he'd made too many brownies and thought we might enjoy them. Standing in my doorway, he peered past me into the house, his pale eyes searching, and asked if Lily was feeling all right since he hadn't seen her outside all morning. The casual way he tracked my daughter's routine made my skin prickle with revulsion, but I managed to keep my voice steady, telling him she had a cold, taking the plate with hands that wanted to slam the door in his face. He lingered on my porch for another minute, mentioning again that he'd be taking a trip soon, just overnight, and would really appreciate if Lily could check on Whiskers, even offered to pay her $5 for the help. The lease paperwork from 2016 still sits in my desk drawer, right next to the pepper spray my mom bought me when I signed it. I just finished my master's degree that May, and this studio apartment in Portland felt like the first real step into adulthood. The building was nothing special, just a converted warehouse from the 60s with thin walls and radiators that clanged like someone was beating them with a wrench, but the rent was manageable on my salary as a lab technician at the hospital. For the first 8 months, everything was perfect. I'd come home from my shifts, usually around 7 in the evening, kick off my scrubs, and enjoy the quiet sanctuary of my own space. The only neighbor I ever noticed was Mrs. Huang across the hall, who'd sometimes leave containers of dumplings outside my door when she made too many. Then Walter moved into the unit directly below mine. I remember that Tuesday in January because I was carrying groceries up the stairs when I saw him for the first time, standing in his doorway watching the movers haul in a leather recliner that looked like it belonged in a hunting lodge. He had this way of standing that made him seem larger than he actually was, shoulders rolled forward, arms crossed tight against his barrel chest. His hair was thinning on top but long in the back, greasy strands that touched his collar, and when he smiled at me, only half his mouth moved, like the other side was holding on to some private joke. I nodded politely, shifted my grocery bags to one arm to wave, and immediately regretted it when he took it as an invitation to introduce himself. His handshake was damp and he held on a beat too long, telling me how nice it was to finally meet a neighbor, how quiet the building seemed, how he hoped we'd be friends. The first complaint came 3 weeks later. I'd gotten home late from a double shift, around 11 at night, and was making myself a quick dinner when I heard the pounding on my door. Walter stood there in a stained undershirt and sweatpants, his face red and puffy like he'd been drinking. He said my footsteps were keeping him awake, that I walked like I was trying to stomp through the floor, and didn't I have any consideration for the people living below me? I apologized, genuinely confused because I'd been wearing socks and trying to move quietly. But he kept going, saying the microwave humming was like a drill in his skull, that even the water running through the pipes sounded like a waterfall in his bedroom. I promised to be more careful, and he left, but not before leaning in close enough that I could smell the beer and something else, something sour like milk left out too long. After that night, I became hyper-aware of every sound I made. I started taking my shoes off in the hallway, tiptoed everywhere like I was walking on glass, even stopped using my microwave after 9. But the complaints kept coming. He'd text me at all hours, long rambling messages about how I was doing it on purpose, how I was trying to drive him crazy, how women like me thought we were so much better than everyone else. I showed them to my friend Natalie, who works security at the hospital, and she told me to stop responding, to document everything, to call the landlord. But our landlord, Mr. Jameson, was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. He said neighbor disputes weren't his problem, that we needed to work it out like adults, and besides, Walter always paid his rent on time. The day I stopped responding to his texts was a Wednesday in March. I'd finally had enough after he sent me 17 messages in 2 hours while I was trying to sleep before a morning shift. I blocked his number, and for about 6 hours, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. But when I got home that evening, there was a note shoved under my door, written in pencil so hard it had torn through the paper in places. He called me names I won't repeat, said I was a stuck-up princess who needed to learn some respect, that ignoring him was the biggest mistake I'd ever make. The next morning, another note, this one longer, describing in detail all the ways he could hear me moving around, like he was keeping a log of my every step. He knew when I showered, when I cooked, when I watched TV, even when I rolled over in bed. That's when I stopped sleeping properly. I'd lie there in the dark, straining to hear any sound from below, wondering if he was awake too, listening to me breathe. I bought a white noise machine, but it made things worse because then I couldn't hear if someone was at my door. I started sleeping on my couch instead of my bed, thinking maybe he couldn't hear me as well from the living room. But the notes kept coming, each one angrier, more unhinged, accusing me of deliberately tormenting him with my existence. He'd slip them under the door at random times, and I'd hear his footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate, like he wanted me to know he was there. Sometimes I'd find them when I left for work at 6 in the morning, meaning he'd been up all night writing them, or worse, waiting for the right moment to deliver them. I finally called the police on a Saturday afternoon after I found a note that made my stomach turn to ice. He'd written about how thin the floors were, how he could map out my apartment just by listening, how he knew exactly where my bed was positioned because he could hear the frame creak when I got in. The 2 officers who showed up looked bored before I even finished explaining. They said, unless he made a direct threat of violence, it was a civil matter. One of them, Officer Murphy, actually suggested I try being friendlier, maybe bake him some cookies, work things out neighbor to neighbor. They did knock on his door, but Walter didn't answer, and they shrugged and left. 20 minutes after their patrol car pulled away, I heard him laughing through the floor. This low, grinding sound that went on until I grabbed my keys and left, spending the night at Natalie's place. The tapping started the following Monday night. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe a mouse in the walls, just this soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere near my bedroom. But it was too regular, too deliberate, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 like someone knocking politely on a door. I followed the sound, pressing my ear to different spots on the floor until I realized it was coming from directly under my bed. My apartment had hardwood floors with a few area rugs, and when I got down on my stomach with my phone flashlight, I could see between the old floorboards and spots. The tapping stopped the second I got close, like whatever was making it could sense me there. I stayed frozen on my bedroom floor for maybe 10 minutes, barely breathing, waiting, and then it started again. This time more insistent, almost playful. I convinced myself it had to be the heating system or maybe Walter banging on his ceiling with a broom handle to mess with me. But deep down, something felt wrong about how precisely located the sound was, always right under wherever I happened to be in the bedroom. I started avoiding the room entirely, grabbing my clothes for the next day and changing in the bathroom, sleeping on the couch permanently. But 2 nights later, the tapping followed me. First under the couch, then under the kitchen table when I sat there with my laptop, then under the bathroom when I tried to take a shower. It was like he had a map of my apartment and was following my every move from below, announcing his presence with those soft, maddening taps. I called Natalie, begging her to come over and listen, to tell me I wasn't going insane. But by the time she arrived, the tapping had stopped completely. That's when I remembered something the building superintendent had mentioned when I first moved in, something about maintenance access panels in each unit for the plumbing and electrical work. He'd pointed to a painted-over square in my bedroom closet floor, said it connected to a crawl space that ran between the floors, told me never to open it because it was full of asbestos or lead paint or some other hazard, that would cost the owner too much to fix properly. I'd forgotten about it completely until that moment, standing in my living room with Natalie, both of us listening to the silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. We went to my bedroom closet, pushed aside the boxes of winter clothes and old textbooks, and there it was, that square outline in the floor, except the paint around the edges was cracked now, little white flakes scattered on the dark wood like snow, and one corner of the panel was slightly raised, just enough that you could see the black gap underneath if you looked at the right angle. Natalie grabbed a screwdriver from my kitchen drawer and we pried the panel up together, our phone's lights aimed down into the darkness. The crawl space was maybe 3 feet high, filled with pipes and wiring and decades of dust, but there were clear drag marks in the dirt, fresh ones leading from the direction of Walter's apartment to directly under my bedroom. And there, caught on a nail, was a piece of fabric from what looked like the same stained undershirt he'd worn that first night he complained. We could see where he'd cleared a path, pushed aside insulation, even set up what looked like a foam pad right under where my bed would be. Natalie was already calling 911 while I stood there, staring at a notebook he'd left behind, filled with pages and pages of times and descriptions, every sound I'd made for weeks, noting when I cried, when I talked on the phone, when I breathed too heavily. The last entry from just hours before simply said, "Tonight she'll finally understand we belong together." The police found Walter in the crawl space when they arrived, curled up on that foam pad directly under my bed, with a battery-powered lantern and a thermos of coffee like he was camping. He didn't resist when they dragged him out through his own apartment's access panel, just kept saying I'd invited him, that the way I walked was a code, that my footsteps had been spelling out messages only he could understand. They arrested him for breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. And at the trial 4 months later, his lawyer tried to argue mental illness, but the notebook showed too much planning, too much careful calculation. He got 18 months in prison and a restraining order that might as well be toilet paper, for all the good it would do if he decided to come back. I moved out the next day, stayed with Natalie until I found a new place, a third-floor apartment in a building with proper security and no crawl spaces. Sometimes at night, when the upstairs neighbors walk around, I still find myself holding my breath, listening for that soft tapping, waiting for it to follow me to my new home. Finding a place we could actually afford felt impossible until we stumbled across that duplex listing in early April. My girlfriend Ashley and I had been sharing a cramped studio since she finished her nursing degree, and we were desperate for space where we wouldn't trip over each other constantly. At 29, I was finally making decent money as a tax preparer, enough that splitting rent on a 2-bedroom didn't seem like financial suicide anymore. Ashley worked rotating shifts at the hospital, 12 hours that left her exhausted, but paid well enough to cover her student loans and still have something left over. We toured the place on a Saturday morning, and within an hour we were signing papers with the landlord, an older guy named Frank, who kept emphasizing how quiet the neighborhood was. He mentioned our neighbor would be sharing the other half of the duplex, some guy named Douglas who'd been there for years and never caused any problems. Moving day came 2 weeks later, and we spent that entire weekend arranging furniture and arguing about where to hang pictures. Ashley had this collection of framed botanical prints from her grandmother that she wanted everywhere, while I just wanted somewhere to put my gaming setup without getting lectured about the mess of cables. We could hear our neighbor through the shared wall, especially at night when everything else got quiet. Footsteps creaking on floorboards, moving from room to room in patterns that seemed almost mechanical, like he was following the same path over and over. His television stayed on constantly, that pale flickering light visible through our bedroom blinds at 3, 4, 5 in the morning. Ashley said maybe he had trouble sleeping, or worked from home on some weird schedule. We figured everyone had their quirks, and at least he wasn't throwing parties or playing drums. About 3 weeks after moving in, we finally saw Douglas for the first time. I was hauling garbage bags to the curb on a Wednesday evening, when he emerged from his side door carrying his own trash. He moved in this careful, deliberate way, like someone recovering from surgery or afraid of pulling a muscle. Mid-40s maybe, wearing a faded polo shirt and khakis that looked like they'd been washed 100 times. His hair was combed straight back with so much gel it looked wet, and he had these thick glasses that magnified his eyes to an uncomfortable size. When he noticed me, he stopped mid-step and just stared for a moment before offering this tight nod. I said hey, introduced myself, mentioned we'd just moved in. He kept nodding while I talked, his mouth slightly open like he was about to respond but couldn't quite form the words. Finally, he muttered something about keeping the noise down after 10 and hurried back inside. Ashley thought I was being dramatic when I told her the interaction made me uncomfortable. She reminded me that plenty of people were awkward or antisocial, and that didn't make them creepy. Still, I started paying more attention to the sounds from next door. The pacing happened every single night without fail, usually starting around 11:15 and continuing until at least 2 in the morning. Sometimes I'd lie awake listening, trying to map out his path through the rooms, kitchen to living room, down the hallway, pause for exactly 30 seconds, then back again. The strangest part was how consistent the timing was, like he was counting steps or following some internal metronome. During the day, we'd hear him occasionally, usually the muffled sound of his television or the microwave beeping. But those nighttime walks were constant, predictable as clockwork. One night in late May, Ashley was working a double shift and wouldn't be home until morning. I'd been trying to sleep, but the pacing seemed louder than usual, more aggressive somehow. Each footstep landed harder, and I could hear him mumbling to himself between circuits. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out words, but it was just this low, continuous stream of syllables that didn't form anything coherent. Then the pacing stopped abruptly, right in the middle of his usual route. Complete silence for maybe 5 minutes. I was just starting to relax when I heard a different sound, a soft scraping coming from inside our apartment. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, listening hard. The scraping continued for another minute or so, like metal against wood, then stopped. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the bed and searched the entire apartment, checking locks, peering into closets. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place. Ashley got home around 7 that morning, exhausted and ready to crash. I tried explaining what had happened, but she was too tired to really process it. Said we'd talk after she got some sleep. While she was in the shower, I decided to do another check of the apartment in daylight. That's when I went into our bedroom closet to grab a clean shirt for work. As I pushed aside the hanging clothes, I noticed something odd about the back wall. There was a small pile of white dust on the floor, like drywall powder. I looked up and found it, about eye level, partially hidden behind Ashley's winter coats. A hole, perfectly round, maybe the width of a pencil. I leaned closer and could see straight through into darkness. My whole body went cold as I realized what this meant. The hole went through our wall directly into Douglas's apartment, positioned at the exact height where someone standing on the other side could look through. I backed out of the closet, legs shaking, trying to process what I'd discovered. How long had that hole been there? Had it existed before we moved in, or had Douglas drilled it recently? The scraping sound from last night suddenly made horrible sense. I thought about all the nights Ashley and I had been in that bedroom, getting dressed, sleeping, being intimate, completely unaware that we might have had an audience. My stomach churned as I remembered how the closet door usually stayed open because the track was broken and it would slide open on its own. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of the hole, the drywall dust, everything. When Ashley came out of the shower, I showed her immediately. The color drained from her face as she understood what she was looking at. She kept saying, "No, no, no," like repetition could make it untrue. We stood there in our bedroom, both of us scanning the walls, wondering if there were other holes we hadn't found yet. Ashley wanted to call the police right away, but I convinced her we should check the rest of the apartment first, document everything properly. We spent the next hour going over every inch of our walls, especially the ones we shared with Douglas. We found 2 more holes, one in the bathroom behind the toilet, another in the living room concealed behind a bookshelf we'd pushed against the wall. Each one was the same size, drilled with precision, angled slightly downward like whoever made them had been standing while looking through. The bathroom one was the worst because it had a clear view of the shower. Ashley started crying when she saw it, realizing how exposed we'd been. I felt rage building in my chest, this hot, violent feeling I'd never experienced before. This man had been watching us, violating our privacy in the most intimate moments of our lives. The pacing at night took on a whole new meaning now. Was he walking from hole to hole, checking on us like we were animals in a zoo? We called the police around 9 that morning. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes, a younger guy who looked fresh out of training, and an older woman who'd clearly seen everything in her years on the job. They took our report, examined the holes, took their own photos. The older officer, Sergeant Martinez, asked if we'd noticed anything missing, or if Douglas had ever tried to make contact beyond that one encounter by the garbage. We told her about the pacing, the constant television, how he'd been doing this routine every single night. She nodded like she'd heard similar stories before, which somehow made it worse. They went next door to talk to Douglas, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway, that beige sedan that looked like it hadn't been washed in years, but no amount of knocking got a response. Sergeant Martinez said they'd need a warrant to enter without probable cause of immediate danger, but they could start the paperwork based on what we'd shown them. Frank, our landlord, arrived about an hour after the police left. He looked genuinely shocked when we showed him the holes, kept apologizing and saying Douglas had been there for 8 years without a single complaint. He authorized us to break our lease immediately, no penalties, and said he'd return our full deposit that day. He also mentioned something that made my skin prickle. The previous tenants, a young married couple, had broken their lease after only 2 months. They'd been vague about why, just said the place wasn't working out. Frank hadn't pushed for details because they'd paid a penalty to leave early. Now he wondered if they'd discovered the same thing we had, but hadn't wanted to deal with the embarrassment or legal hassle of reporting it. While Frank was talking, I noticed movement in Douglas's window. Just a quick shift of the curtains. He was in there, watching us deal with the aftermath of his sick hobby. We stayed in a motel that night. Neither of us could stand the thought of sleeping in that apartment knowing what we knew. Ashley barely spoke during the drive there, just stared out the window with her arms wrapped around herself. I kept checking the rearview mirror, paranoid that Douglas might be following us, but there was no beige sedan trailing behind. The motel room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning products, but it felt safer than our own home. We ordered pizza, but neither of us could eat more than a few bites. Ashley finally broke down completely, sobbing about how violated she felt, how she kept imagining him watching her in the shower, getting dressed, all those private moments that were supposed to be just hers. I held her while she cried, feeling helpless and furious at the same time. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was Sergeant Martinez. She told me they'd gotten their warrant and entered Douglas's apartment that afternoon. What they found was worse than we'd imagined. His living room wall, the one he shared with us, had been turned into some kind of observation station. He'd mounted small monitors connected to tiny cameras he'd threaded through the holes, recording equipment, notebooks filled with detailed logs of our daily routines. The dates went back months before we'd even moved in, documenting the previous tenants' every move. But that wasn't the worst part. They'd found external hard drives containing hundreds of hours of footage, not just of us, but of at least 6 other couples who'd lived in that unit over the years. Douglas had been doing this for nearly a decade, perfecting his sick surveillance system with each new tenant. They'd arrested him on multiple charges, including voyeurism, stalking, and criminal trespass. He hadn't said a word during the arrest, just stared at the officers with that same blank expression I'd seen by the garbage bins. The prosecutor contacted us a few days later to discuss the case. She explained that Douglas would likely take a plea deal to avoid trial, which meant we wouldn't have to testify, but also meant he'd probably serve less time. The thought of him getting out in just a few years made me sick, but Ashley couldn't handle the idea of sitting in a courtroom describing what he'd done to us. We agreed to the plea deal. Douglas got 5 years with possibility of parole in 3, plus lifetime registration as a sex offender. It didn't feel like enough, not even close, but at least he couldn't do this to anyone else for a while. The prosecutor mentioned that they'd managed to identify and contact most of his previous victims. Some of them had noticed strange things but never put it together. Others had no idea they'd been watched for months. One couple had divorced shortly after moving out. The stress of feeling unsafe in their own home had destroyed their relationship, even though they never knew the real reason for their discomfort. Ashley and I found a new apartment on the other side of town, a third-floor unit in a building with proper security and no shared walls. We had a contractor check every inch of it before we moved in, looking for any signs of tampering or hidden cameras. Even now, 6 months later, I still check the walls obsessively, running my fingers along them searching for holes that aren't there. Ashley started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, and some days are better than others. She still can't shower without checking behind the shower curtain multiple times, and she changes clothes in the dark most nights. We're working through it together, but we're different people now, more guarded, less trusting. Sometimes I wake up at 11:15 and listen for footsteps that never come, my body still trained to Douglas's schedule. I know he's locked up, I know we're safe, but that knowledge doesn't stop the feeling that somewhere, somehow, we're still being watched. The detective told me they never figured out why Douglas did it. He never offered any explanation, never showed any remorse. Some people are just broken in ways we'll never understand, she said, and all we can do is try to protect ourselves from them. I think about that a lot, about how evil can live right next door, separated by nothing more than a thin wall and a few inches of insulation, pacing back and forth in the dark, watching, always watching. My divorce lawyer's business card was still sitting on my kitchen counter when I heard the moving truck rumble up next door on a humid Wednesday morning. 6 months of staring at that empty house through my home office window had made me paranoid about every little sound at night, so seeing actual people carrying furniture inside felt like winning a small lottery. I grabbed a 6-pack of beer from my fridge and walked over around noon, figuring it was the neighborly thing to do. Michael Anderson answered the door with paint smeared on his forearm, his wife Laura behind him unwrapping dishes from newspaper, and their teenage son Justin hauling boxes marked garage up from the basement. Medical equipment sales, elementary school teacher, high school junior. They laid out their life stories between sips of beer while we sat on their still plastic-wrapped couch. Laura kept apologizing for the mess while Michael told me about their last place in Michigan, how they'd needed a fresh start after some family drama with Laura's parents. Justin barely looked up from his phone except to ask if I knew any good spots to skateboard, which I didn't, but I appreciated him trying to engage with the old guy next door who was probably his dad's age, class of '05, making me feel every one of those years since graduation. Everything about them screamed normal suburban family for those first few weeks. Michael washing his SUV every Sunday morning, Laura planting marigolds along their front walk, Justin shooting hoops in their driveway after school. I work from home doing technical writing for a software company, basically translating engineer speak into human language, so I had a front row seat to their daily routines from my desk. October rolled in with early frost warnings, and I was actually sleeping well for the first time since signing those papers that split everything down the middle. Until that Saturday night, when metal scraping against dirt pulled me out of a dead sleep at 2:30 in the morning. My bedroom faces their backyard, and through the gap in my curtains I could make out this yellowish light, like from those portable work lamps contractors use. That steady, rhythmic digging sound kept going, shk thud, methodical and purposeful. I lay there for 20 minutes trying to convince myself they were just putting in fence posts or planting a tree. But who does yard work at 2 in the morning, and why would they need to dig for over an hour straight without stopping? Sunday morning came and I expected to see fresh soil or some new garden feature in their yard. But when I casually walked along our shared fence line pretending to check my gutters, everything looked exactly the same. Michael was out there hosing down his SUV like always, whistling some tune I didn't recognize, and he gave me his usual wave with the chamois cloth in his hand. I asked him if he'd heard any raccoons last night, fishing for some explanation, and he just laughed and said they'd all been dead asleep by 9 o'clock. Laura came out with coffee for him, wearing these fuzzy slippers shaped like bear paws, and invited me over for dinner later that week. Standing there in the bright morning sun, watching them be so perfectly ordinary, I started doubting what I'd heard, wondering if maybe the sound had come from somewhere else entirely, or if those sleeping pills my doctor prescribed were messing with my head more than I realized. But then it happened again the following Friday, and this time I was ready. I'd been lying in bed since 11, lights off but wide awake, when that same scraping started at exactly 3 in the morning. This time I didn't stay in bed. I crept to my spare bedroom, which had a better angle of their backyard, and peeked through the blinds. There was Justin, illuminated by one of those camping headlamps, dragging what looked like a heavy contractor bag across their lawn toward the shed they'd installed the week before. The kid was stronger than he looked, managing that bag with steady determination, even though it seemed to weigh nearly as much as he did. Michael stood by the shed door holding it open, and when Justin got close enough, they both lifted the bag together and disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, they came out empty-handed, and Michael put his hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him back toward the house while Justin kept wiping his hands on his jeans over and over again. I couldn't focus on work after that, spending my days staring at their backyard from my office window, watching for any sign of what they might be hiding in that shed. During a conference call about API documentation, I watched Laura hanging laundry on their clothesline, humming and acting like she didn't have a care in the world. Justin would get home from school around 3:30, drop his backpack on the porch, and shoot baskets until dinner, never once going near the shed during daylight hours. Michael started working on some project in their garage with the door open, sawing and hammering away at what looked like shelving units, occasionally calling Justin over to hold a board steady. They were playing the part of the perfect family so well that I began to question my own sanity, wondering if stress from the divorce had finally pushed me into some kind of paranoid breakdown. My ex-wife had always said I overthought everything, turned molehills into mountains, and maybe she'd been right all along. I decided to test them, to see if I could get any kind of reaction that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. That Wednesday, when Laura invited me for dinner, I accepted, showing up with a bottle of wine and my best attempt at normal conversation. Their house smelled like pot roast and fresh bread, with family photos covering every surface. Justin, at various ages, always with that same crooked smile. Michael and Laura on vacation somewhere tropical, everyone looking genuinely happy. We ate at their dining room table while Justin talked about his history project on the Cold War, and Michael shared stories from his sales trips to rural hospitals. When I mentioned casually that I'd been having trouble sleeping lately, hearing strange noises at night, Laura's fork paused halfway to her mouth for just a second before she suggested I try chamomile tea. Michael jumped in immediately, talking about how the neighborhood had tons of wildlife, possums, raccoons, even a fox family that lived in the woods behind our street. Justin stayed quiet, pushing green beans around his plate, until his father asked him about basketball tryouts, and he launched into an enthusiastic recap of practice. After dinner, Michael offered to show me the shelving he'd been building in the garage, and I followed him out through their kitchen door, noticing how Laura's smile tightened when he suggested it. The garage was meticulously organized, tools hanging on pegboard in order of size, lumber stacked against the far wall with labels indicating length and type. Michael ran his hand along one of the shelves he'd finished, explaining his process for getting the joints perfectly flush, but I kept glancing toward the backyard, toward that shed sitting in the corner of their property like a secret wrapped in aluminum siding. I asked him what they kept in there, trying to sound casual, just making conversation, and he didn't miss a beat. Lawn equipment, holiday decorations, the usual suburban overflow that doesn't fit in the garage. He even offered to show me. Started walking toward the door, but then Laura called from inside that Justin needed help with his math homework, and Michael apologized, said we'd have to do the tour another time. I went home that night more convinced than ever that they were hiding something, and I made a decision that I'm not proud of, but couldn't stop myself from following through on. I ordered one of those wildlife cameras online, the kind hunters use, with night vision and motion activation. When it arrived 2 days later, I spent an afternoon pretending to trim the bushes along our fence line while I mounted it to a tree that had a clear view of their shed. The camera was smaller than I expected, olive green plastic that blended into the bark, and I angled it just right to capture anyone approaching from their house. That first night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour for motion alerts, but nothing triggered it except a cat around midnight and what looked like a possum just before dawn. Friday came and went with no activity, Saturday too, and I started to wonder if they'd somehow noticed the camera, if they were waiting me out, playing some kind of psychological game where they knew I was watching and wanted to see how long I'd keep it up. Monday night changed everything, and I wished to God I'd never installed that camera, never looked at what it captured. The alert came through at 2:47 a.m., and when I opened the app on my phone, the infrared image showed all 3 of them in their backyard, but this time they weren't heading to the shed. They were standing in a circle on their lawn, each holding what looked like a small gardening trowel, and they were digging, but not in one spot. They were making a pattern, connected holes about the size of coffee cans, maybe a dozen of them arranged in some kind of shape I couldn't quite make out from the camera angle. Laura was wearing a bathrobe over pajamas, her hair tied back with what looked like a bandana, and she kept checking something on her phone, like she was following instructions or keeping track of time. Michael had on sweatpants and a hoodie, moving between the holes and measuring distances with a tape measure, making sure everything was precise. Justin looked exhausted, rubbing his eyes between digging sessions, but his parents kept him moving, Laura touching his shoulder whenever he slowed down. Not roughly, but insistent, like this was something that absolutely had to be finished before sunrise. Then they started bringing things out from the shed, and my mouth went completely dry watching them work with such practiced efficiency. First came small cloth bags, the kind banks use for coins, each one tied with colored string, red, blue, yellow, green, and they placed one bag in each hole with careful deliberation. Michael went back to the shed and returned with what looked like mason jars filled with dark liquid, and they poured a small amount from each jar onto the bags, the liquid soaking into the soil. The smell must have been strong because even Justin pulled his shirt up over his nose, and Laura turned her face away each time she poured. They worked in complete silence except for the occasional whispered instruction from Michael, and I realized they'd done this before, many times, because everyone knew exactly what their role was, when to move, where to stand. After the liquid came white powder from a plastic container, sprinkled over each hole like they were seasoning food. And then finally they began covering everything with dirt, patting it down flat, making the lawn look undisturbed. I sat there staring at my phone screen until the battery died, trying to process what I'd witnessed, and when I finally got up to plug it in, I noticed movement outside my window. Michael was standing at the fence line between our properties, just standing there in the darkness, facing my house. I couldn't see his expression, couldn't tell if he was looking at my window specifically or just staring at the house in general. But he stood there for what must have been 5 full minutes before turning and walking back to his house. The next morning I called in sick to work. Couldn't imagine trying to write documentation while knowing what my neighbors had buried in their yard. Around 10 o'clock, Laura knocked on my door with a plate of fresh muffins, blueberry with a crumb topping, and her smile was so warm, so genuine, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. She asked if I was feeling all right, said Michael mentioned seeing my lights on late last night, wondered if my insomnia was getting worse. I took the muffins, thanked her, told her I was fine, just work stress, and she patted my arm like a concerned mother before heading back to her house. That afternoon, I couldn't stand it anymore and decided to check the fence line where I'd installed the camera, telling myself I was just making sure it was still hidden. But when I got to the tree, the camera was gone. Not damaged, not hanging loose, just gone. Like it had never been there at all, and the only evidence it had existed was a small indentation in the bark where I'd secured the strap. I stood there running my fingers over that mark, and when I turned around, Justin was standing about 10 feet away, holding a basketball, just watching me. He didn't say anything at first, just bounced the ball once, twice, 3 times, the sound sharp in the quiet afternoon, and then he asked if I'd lost something, if I needed help looking for it. I told him no, just checking for damage from the storm we'd had last week, even though there hadn't been any storm, and he nodded slowly, said his dad was good with tree stuff if I needed help, then walked back to his driveway and continued shooting hoops like nothing had happened. That night I lay in bed with every door locked, chair wedged under the doorknob of my bedroom door, telling myself I was being ridiculous but unable to shake the feeling that they were done playing games with me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on my front porch, slow and deliberate, followed by a gentle knock. Not urgent or aggressive, just 3 soft taps like someone dropping by to borrow sugar. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there listening as the knocking came again. Same pattern, same politeness. And then I heard Michael's voice, calm and friendly, asking if I was awake, saying he had something to show me in the shed, something that would explain everything. He waited maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard his footsteps moving away, down my porch steps, and the night went quiet again. I stayed frozen in that bed until sunrise, and when I finally worked up the courage to check my front door, there was a single manila envelope tucked into the frame. No name, no address, just sitting there waiting for me. Inside the envelope were photographs, dozens of them, all taken from angles that showed my house, my bedroom window, my home office, my backyard, even one through my kitchen window showing me making coffee. But the dates on the photos, the little timestamps in the corner, they were all from before the Andersons moved in, some going back months when the house was supposedly empty. The last photo in the stack showed me installing the camera on the tree, taken from behind, so close I could see the sweat stain on my shirt collar. On the back, someone had written in neat blue ink, "We were here first. We were always here. Stop looking or we'll have to stop being neighbors." I packed a bag that morning, threw it in my car along with my laptop and whatever clothes I could grab in 5 minutes, and drove to a motel 3 towns over. I called a real estate agent from the motel room, told them to list my house immediately, take whatever offer came first. I didn't care about the money anymore. The house sold in 2 weeks to a cash buyer who waived inspection, which should have been my first red flag, but I was too relieved to care. I signed the papers electronically, never went back to collect the rest of my things, just had a moving company pack everything up and put it in storage. Started over in a different state, got a small apartment near downtown where there were always people around, always lights and noise and activity. For months I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, heart racing, waiting to hear that scraping sound, but it never came. Slowly I started to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood everything. Maybe they were just eccentric people with weird hobbies. Maybe the photos had been taken by a previous owner or some real estate company doing market research. Then about a year later, I was mindlessly scrolling through news articles when I saw it. A story about human remains being discovered in Pine Valley Road during construction of a new development. The house next to mine had been demolished, and when they started excavating for the foundation, they found bones, lots of them, some dating back decades. The article mentioned that the previous owners, a family of 3, had disappeared without a trace, leaving no forwarding address, no trail to follow. I still think about the Andersons sometimes, usually when I'm trying to fall asleep and the room is too quiet. I wonder if they're out there somewhere, living next to someone else now, washing their car on Sunday mornings, bringing over casseroles, burying things in patterns under cover of darkness. I changed my name after I moved, deleted all my social media, got a new phone number, did everything I could to disappear, but sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of someone who looks like Michael at the grocery store, or hear a laugh that sounds like Laura's, or see a teenager bouncing a basketball with that same steady rhythm. Once, twice, 3 times. And I know it's not them. It can't be them, they don't know where I am. But I still leave the store immediately, still drive a different route home, still check my locks twice before bed. Because the thing that haunts me most isn't what they were burying or why they were doing it. It's that note, those 5 words that made everything clear. We were always here. They weren't the new neighbors moving in next to me. I was the one who'd moved in next to them. And whatever they were doing, whatever they were hiding, I'd gotten too close to something that was never meant to be found. There was a time when quiet meant safety to me. My house sat at the very end of a small cul-de-sac, surrounded by elm trees that rustled even when there was no wind. The neighborhood had a strange kind of calm, the kind that made every sound stand out, like a door creak or the distant bark of a dog. I'd moved there for peace after a long and messy breakup, and my days were a mix of remote work, long walks, and late nights reading by the kitchen window. I barely knew anyone until the old man next door, Mr. Henry Lawson, started showing up with a basket of muffins or pie every few days. He had that gentle, old-fashioned politeness that made me think of another era. Henry lived alone in the house across the street, the one with the ivy crawling up the porch rails and the heavy green shutters. He liked to talk about how the cul-de-sac used to be full of families, how the kids ran through the sprinklers right there, pointing at the patch of grass between our driveways. His stories were warm at first, and I liked listening. He would smile, his eyes almost hidden behind thick glasses, and talk about good neighbors, good times. But after a while, I started noticing how he always seemed to glance toward his basement door, as if making sure it was still closed every time I visited. The first odd thing happened one night in early autumn. I was closing my kitchen window when I heard a metallic clang, followed by a dull thud that seemed to come from Henry's house. It was late, nearly midnight, and the sound was so distinct that I turned off the lights just to listen. There it was again, like something heavy being dragged on concrete. I told myself maybe he was moving furniture or storing tools. But when I looked out, I saw a faint yellow light flickering through the narrow basement window on his side of the house. It went out seconds later, leaving the yard in complete darkness. The next day, I brought up the noise casually. Henry chuckled and said he had been fixing his furnace. His tone was friendly, but something about the way he tightened his grip on the pie plate caught my attention. He thanked me for checking in, then quickly changed the subject, asking if I liked pecan or apple better. I noticed his hands were rough, like someone who still did heavy work despite his age. When he walked me to the door, he locked it right after I stepped out. I heard the click before I even reached the gate. At the time, I laughed it off as an old man's habit. But that sound of the lock turning stayed in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. A few evenings later, I was walking back from the mailbox when I saw Henry outside, kneeling beside his garden shed. He was digging into the soil, carefully piling dirt into a wheelbarrow. When he noticed me, he smiled and waved, but there was something odd about how quickly he covered the hole with a tarp. I asked if he needed help, and he said it was just old pipes, his voice softer than usual. Behind him, the basement door stood wide open for the first time, and I caught a glimpse of stairs leading down into dim light. A chill went through me, not fear exactly, but a sense that I had stepped too close to something private. Later that night, it started again. Scraping, slow and rhythmic, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I pressed my ear against the wall that faced his house and waited. For a moment, there was nothing. And then 3 sharp knocks echoed through the quiet like someone hitting metal. I nearly called the police, but stopped myself. How would that sound? My neighbor's basement is making noises? It felt ridiculous. So I sat there, lights off, watching that same narrow basement window glow faintly again. The light swayed as if someone was walking with a lantern. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. The next afternoon, I made a reason to visit, returning his pie dish. He invited me in, cheerful as always, and I immediately noticed how cold the house was. It smelled faintly of bleach and old paper. We talked in the kitchen for a while until he excused himself to check something downstairs. I waited until I heard the lock click behind him before stepping quietly toward the hallway. The basement door was heavy, reinforced with a thick padlock that looked newer than the rest of the house. Beside the door, an old framed photograph caught my attention. Several people standing on the same street, all smiling. I recognized none of them except Henry, decades younger, standing right where my house would be built years later. That night, I searched for the street name online, just out of curiosity. What I found made my heart pound. A few old newspaper scans mentioned disappearances from this exact block, 3 different people, spread over 20 years. The reports were vague, mentioning no signs of forced entry and residents last seen near the end of the cul-de-sac. In 2 of the articles, the name Henry Lawson appeared as a witness who reported unusual noises, or was among the last to see the missing person. I stared at his picture in the article. The same calm expression, the same faint smile. I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but the more I read, the harder that became. The next morning, I saw him standing in his yard, trimming the hedges like any other day. The normalcy of it unsettled me. I could not stop thinking about those articles. I printed them out and kept them on my table, reading and rereading the lines that mentioned his name. At one point, I glanced out the window and realized he was watching me. Not directly. His head was tilted just enough that I could see the reflection of my house in his glasses. When our eyes finally met, he smiled and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. That night, the noises started again, louder than before. Around 3 in the morning, I called the police. I told them there was a disturbance next door and that I believed someone might be hurt. They came within 20 minutes, 2 officers walking up his driveway with flashlights. I watched from my window as Henry opened the door in his robe, calm as ever. They talked for a few minutes. Then one of the officers laughed at something he said. After a short look around the backyard, they left. Henry stood there for a while after they were gone, just staring at my window before slowly going back inside. The next day, a pie tin sat on my porch filled with cookies and a small note that read, "No hard feelings, neighbor." I barely slept that week. I packed a small bag and decided to stay with a friend across town for a few days. But before leaving, I felt compelled to check something. The old police reports had mentioned a storm drain that connected several properties on our street, one entrance behind Henry's shed. I went out early that morning and walked around to the back of his fence. The air smelled damp, metallic. I found the drain partially hidden by vines and crouched down. Inside, barely visible in the dark, was the glint of a chain and something else. Fabric, pale and torn. I stepped back so fast I nearly fell, my heartbeat filling my ears. I moved out 2 weeks later. The house sold quicker than I expected, and I never went back to that neighborhood. I did call the police again, anonymously this time, and told them about the drain. Whether they ever looked into it, I will never know. Every now and then I search Henry Lawson's name online. Nothing new ever comes up. But sometimes when the nights are too quiet, I catch myself listening, waiting for that faint metallic sound that used to echo from his basement, the one that told me I was never really alone on that street. It started with something small, a cracked fence post between my yard and the man next door. I remember noticing it after a storm that had torn through the area overnight. The wooden panels leaned slightly toward my side, and when I mentioned it to him, he said it was probably my fault for letting my shrubs grow too close. His name was Howard, a retired mechanic who spent most of his days sitting on his porch with a can of beer. We weren't friends, but I had always tried to be polite. Until that day, we had never exchanged more than a few neighborly words. At first, I figured our little argument would blow over. People get touchy about property lines. I offered to split the cost of repairs, but he just walked away mid-sentence, muttering something I couldn't catch. A week later, I noticed he'd parked his old truck in a way that blocked part of my driveway. The next morning, There were dead potted plants tossed onto my lawn, their roots exposed, soil scattered like ashes. I didn't have proof it was him, but who else would do something like that? Things kept escalating in quiet, unsettling ways. The motion light above my garage started flickering every night, always around the same hour. I replaced the bulb, checked the wiring. It wasn't that. One evening, I caught him standing on his porch, staring straight at my kitchen window while I washed dishes. He didn't look away, didn't move, just stood there with this blank expression, his beer can resting against the railing. It wasn't rage on his face or even amusement. It was emptiness, like he was waiting for something. That's when I decided to call the city and report him for harassment and illegal dumping. I didn't want to, but I was tired of feeling watched. The officer I spoke to said they'd send someone by to talk to him. For a couple of days, things were quiet. Then one night, the power went out across the whole block. I thought it was just another outage, until I saw a faint shape near the fence line, standing perfectly still, right inside my backyard. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The moonlight barely reached the backyard, but I could see enough to make out the outline of someone near the fence. I stood still by the window, hoping maybe it was a tree or a shadow from a neighbor's yard. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately, closer to the house. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I didn't grab my phone right away because I didn't want to draw attention with the light. I just stayed there, watching, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. The figure stepped under the porch light, and even though the power was out, there was just enough glow from a nearby street lamp to see the jacket. It was Howard's. That same faded denim jacket he wore every day, the one with oil stains on the sleeves. He wasn't holding a flashlight. He wasn't holding anything. He was just standing there, facing the back door like he was waiting for it to open. I crouched down behind the counter, clutching my house keys so tightly they left marks in my hand. After what felt like forever, he turned toward the side gate. I heard the latch rattle, but it didn't open. I realized I had locked it earlier that evening. Thank God. Then came the sound of footsteps circling the side of the house, slow and dragging. My dog, Benny, started whining from under the table. He never barked, just whimpered, like he knew we weren't supposed to make a sound. I stayed crouched there, counting the seconds between each step until everything went silent again. Minutes later, the hum of the refrigerator kicked back in. The power had returned. The light flickered on, and I ran to the front window to see if he was still outside. The porch was empty. His truck was gone. But something caught my eye near the curb. A trail of wet footprints leading from my backyard to the street, faint but visible under the lamplight. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt sharper, every creak louder, and I kept picturing that jacket in the dark. The next morning, I went outside and found that part of the fence had been pushed inward again, this time splintered at the base. A muddy boot print sat right beside it. I took photos and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the prints had mostly dried, and they said there wasn't enough to go on. One of the officers knocked on Howard's door, but no one answered. His truck wasn't there either. They told me to call if he came back, though they didn't sound convinced it was serious. Maybe they deal with too many neighbor disputes to see when one is different. Over the next few days, I barely left the house. Every creak from the porch made me tense up. I started keeping a flashlight and a kitchen knife near the bed, just in case. Then, one afternoon, a city inspector came by to confirm the harassment complaint I had filed. He said Howard had been issued a warning notice but hadn't been seen at his address since. Apparently, the house belonged to his brother, who told them Howard had moved out suddenly and left most of his belongings behind. I asked if that included his truck. The inspector said no. There was no truck in the driveway when they went by. For a while, things actually went quiet. The lights stayed steady, the fence untouched. I even started sleeping better. But about 2 weeks later, a small brown package showed up on my doorstep. No return address, no label. Inside was a single photo, printed on cheap glossy paper. It was a picture of my backyard, taken from outside the fence in the dark. The back door was open, and I was standing in the kitchen facing away from the camera. I called the police again, but they couldn't trace where the package came from. They suggested maybe it was a prank and that I should install security cameras. I did. For months, nothing happened. No one appeared, no more packages. Still, every time the power flickers or the motion light clicks on, I find myself staring through that same window, expecting to see a figure in a denim jacket standing by the fence, waiting for me to step outside. December 23rd fell on a Monday that year, and my wife packed the minivan while I watched from the living room couch, wrapped in 2 blankets and sweating through a fever that had started 4 days earlier. Kayla and the kids were heading to her parents' place in Wisconsin, a 6-hour drive that I normally dreaded, but now desperately wished I could make. Our daughter Lily, just turned 7, pressed her face against the front window and waved at me with both hands before climbing into her booster seat. My son Owen, barely 5, blew me a kiss that made my chest ache worse than the congestion. The flu had hit me like a freight train the week before Christmas, the kind where your bones feel like they're filled with concrete and every cough tears something loose in your lungs. Kayla kissed my forehead, told me to rest and drink fluids, and promised they'd FaceTime me on Christmas morning when Lily opened her presents. I watched the red taillights disappear down Crescent Road around 4 in the afternoon, and suddenly our 2-story colonial felt enormous and hollow. That first evening alone passed in a haze of NyQuil and bad television. I managed to heat up some soup around 8, shuffled to the bathroom twice, and fell asleep on the couch, because climbing the stairs to our bedroom felt like scaling Everest. The house creaked and settled the way old houses do when winter temperatures drop, and I barely registered any of it through my medicated fog. Our neighborhood in the suburbs outside of Milwaukee was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked during the day and waved at each other from their driveways. We had moved there 3 years earlier, right after Owen was born, trading our cramped apartment for a house with a backyard and a 2-car garage. The block was mostly families with young kids and a few retired couples, the sort of street where nothing interesting ever happened. That night, I remember thinking how peaceful the silence was without the kids running around, how the only sounds were the furnace clicking on and the occasional car passing outside. By 11, I had dragged myself upstairs to the master bedroom, taken another dose of cold medicine, and collapsed into bed with my phone on the nightstand. What woke me was a sound that my fever-addled brain tried to explain away as a dream. A heavy thump somewhere below, like a package being dropped on the front porch. Christmas Eve was the next day, and we had been getting deliveries all week, so my first thought was that some overnight driver was dropping off a late shipment. I squinted at my phone, 2:47 in the morning, and figured I would deal with it tomorrow. But then came another thump, this one different, more like weight shifting on wood, and then a third sound that made me sit up in bed despite every muscle in my body screaming in protest. It was voices, muffled, low, but unmistakably human voices coming from somewhere outside the house. I told myself it was probably neighbors coming home late from a party, maybe struggling with their own holiday packages. The fever made everything feel distant and surreal, like watching a movie through a fogged window. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, listening, my heart starting to beat faster despite my attempts to rationalize what I was hearing. The master bedroom sat at the back of the house, with 2 windows overlooking the backyard and the wooden fence that separated our property from the Nguyens place behind us. I did not turn on any lights. Some instinct I cannot fully explain kept me in the dark as I moved toward the window. The blinds were partially open, the way Kayla always left them because she liked waking up to natural light. I pressed my face close to the glass and looked down into the yard, and what I saw made every symptom of my illness vanish in a single instant of pure, crystalline terror. 3 figures dressed in dark clothing were climbing over the back fence, one already dropping into our yard, while the other 2 straddled the top. They moved with practiced coordination, no wasted motion, no hesitation. One of them pulled out a flashlight and swept the beam across the back of our house, pausing on the sliding glass door that led to the kitchen. I pulled back from the window so fast I nearly tripped over the nightstand, my breath suddenly loud and ragged in the silent bedroom. These were not neighbors. These were not delivery drivers. These were men breaking into my home in the middle of the night, and I was completely alone. My phone was still on the nightstand, and I grabbed it with fingers that felt numb and clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. I dialed 911 and pressed the phone to my ear, keeping my voice as low as physically possible when the dispatcher answered. I whispered our address, told her there were 3 men breaking into my house right now, that I was sick and alone and unarmed. She asked me to stay on the line and told me officers were being dispatched, but her voice sounded impossibly far away, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of glass breaking somewhere downstairs, followed by the scrape and click of the sliding door being forced open. They were inside. The dispatcher was saying something about staying hidden, about not confronting them, but I was already moving toward the bedroom closet because it was the only place I could think of. Our closet was a walk-in, not huge but deep enough that I could press myself into the back corner behind Kayla's winter coats. I slid the door shut as quietly as I could manage, leaving it open just a crack so I was not in complete darkness. From inside that closet I could hear everything with terrible clarity. Footsteps on the hardwood floors downstairs, heavy and unhurried, moving through the living room and into the kitchen. Then a voice, male, speaking just loud enough that the words drifted up through the heating vents that connected every room in the house. Clear the first floor fast, then upstairs. Families in Wisconsin until the 26th. I saw them pack the car. Another voice responded, younger sounding, almost eager. What about the alarm? The first voice laughed, a short, humorless sound. No alarm. These neighborhoods never have real security, just those fake signs in the front yard. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound, my whole body trembling not from fever now but from something far more primal. They knew. They had watched us. They had seen Kayla and the kids leave, had noted our habits, had probably driven past our house a dozen times over the past week waiting for this exact moment. This was not random. This was planned. The dispatcher was still on the line, her voice a tinny whisper from the phone I had pressed against my thigh to muffle any sound. I could hear her asking if I was still there, if I was safe, but I could not risk answering because the footsteps had reached the bottom of the stairs. There was a pause, a murmured conversation I could not make out, and then the creak of the first step. They were coming up. I had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the second floor, before they started opening doors, before they found the master bedroom and the closet where I was hiding like a child afraid of monsters. Except these monsters were real, and they were methodical, and I had nothing to defend myself with except a bottle of NyQuil and a box of tissues. The phone screen glowed faintly against my leg, and I watched the call timer tick upward, 4 minutes and 12 seconds since I had dialed. The dispatcher had said officers were on their way, but our suburb was not exactly a high-crime area. Response times could be 10 minutes, 15, maybe longer on a holiday week when half the force was on vacation. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. I heard one of them breathing, a thick, wet sound like he had a cold of his own, and then a flashlight beam swept under the crack of the closet door, moving left to right across the bedroom carpet. "Check the kids' rooms first," the older voice said, and the footsteps moved away down the hall toward Lily's room with its purple walls and stuffed animals. I heard the door open, heard someone rummaging through drawers, and then a different voice, the third man who had not spoken before, called out something about jewelry and a laptop. They were professionals. They knew exactly what they were looking for, knew which rooms to hit, knew how to move through a house quickly and efficiently. The closet suddenly felt impossibly small, the winter coats pressing against my back like hands trying to push me forward. I could smell Kayla's perfume on one of her jackets, a scent that usually comforted me, but now made me want to scream because it reminded me of everything I stood to lose if these men found me hiding in the dark. Then the bedroom door opened. The hinges made a soft whine that I had been meaning to fix for months, and now that tiny neglected chore felt like a death sentence announcing my location. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the bed with its rumpled sheets, across the nightstand with the half-empty glass of water and the bottle of cough syrup. I held my breath so completely that my lungs started to burn, my vision going spotty at the edges from lack of oxygen and pure concentrated fear. Footsteps crossed the carpet, moving toward the bathroom first. I heard the shower curtain being pulled back, the medicine cabinet opening and closing. "Nothing in here," the younger voice called out. "Check the closet," the older one responded from somewhere in the hallway, and I felt every muscle in my body lock up tight. This was it. There was nowhere else to hide, no escape route, no weapon within reach. I was going to be found by men who had broken into my home expecting it to be empty, and I had no idea what they would do when they discovered they were wrong. The closet door started to slide open, and in that moment I did something I still cannot fully explain. Maybe it was the fever, maybe it was some desperate survival instinct, but I started coughing. Not quietly, not trying to suppress it. I let loose with the worst, most wretched hacking cough I could produce, the kind that sounded like tuberculosis and pneumonia combined. The door stopped moving. I kept coughing, adding a wet gurgling sound that came naturally given how congested I actually was. And then I heard the younger voice say something sharp and panicked. "Someone's in there! Someone's sick in there!" There was a commotion in the hallway, whispered arguing, and then the older voice cut through with authority. "Leave it, we got enough, let's move." The closet door slid shut again, and I heard footsteps retreating fast down the hallway, down the stairs, and then the slam of the back door. I kept coughing even after they were gone, unable to stop now that I had started, my whole body convulsing with the effort as tears streamed down my face. The police arrived, 11 minutes after I had first dialed, which meant they missed the intruders by maybe 3 or 4 minutes. I was still in the closet when I heard sirens, still clutching my phone with the 911 call at 17 minutes, and counting. 2 officers came through the broken back door with their weapons drawn, calling out and identifying themselves, and I finally managed to croak out that I was upstairs, that I was the homeowner, that the men were gone. They found me sitting on the closet floor surrounded by winter coats, shaking so badly that one of them thought I was having a seizure. The paramedics they called checked my vitals and said my fever had spiked to 103, probably from the stress and adrenaline. They wanted to take me to the hospital, but I refused because I could not stand the thought of leaving my house empty again, even with police tape on the back door. An officer stayed with me until morning while detectives processed the scene, dusting for fingerprints and photographing the damage. They had taken my laptop, Kayla's jewelry box, some cash from my desk drawer, and Owen's piggy bank that had maybe $40 in quarters. I called Kayla at 6 in the morning and told her what happened, and she drove back that same day with the kids, cutting their trip short by 3 days. We installed a real security system the week after Christmas, cameras and motion sensors, and an alarm that connects directly to the police department. The detectives caught 2 of the 3 men about a month later. They had been running the same operation across 4 counties, targeting houses where families had visibly left for the holidays. The younger one, the one whose panic at my coughing probably saved my life, was only 19 years old. He told the police that they specifically looked for signs that homeowners were traveling. Cars loaded with luggage, piled up mail, dark windows at night. They had watched our house for a week before deciding it was safe. What they never counted on was a sick husband staying behind. I still think about that night sometimes, especially during the holidays when the house gets quiet and I hear sounds I cannot immediately explain. That closet is just a closet now, full of clothes and shoes and normal everyday things. But every time I open the door, I remember what it felt like to hide there in the dark, listening to strangers move through my home, waiting to be found. My co-workers used to joke that I was the last person who would ever get into trouble. Quiet, responsible, always the designated driver at happy hours. That was me at 24, fresh out of college and working my first real corporate job at an insurance firm in Richmond, Virginia. I had been there for about 18 months when the 2016 holiday season rolled around, and our manager Gloria booked a private room at this upscale Italian place downtown for our Christmas dinner. I remember spending an hour doing my makeup that night, wearing my nicest black dress, the pearl earrings my grandmother left me, and feeling like I had finally arrived somewhere in life. The restaurant had exposed brick walls, dim Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and this gorgeous marble bar that made you feel important just by standing near it. I was so focused on having a good time, on fitting in with people I admired, that I never once considered anything could go wrong. 9 years later, I still get a knot in my stomach every time office holiday parties come around, because what happened after that dinner changed the way I move through the world forever. The dinner itself was perfect, almost annoyingly so in retrospect. Our group of about 15 people laughed, exchanged white elephant gifts, and drank way too much red wine for a Wednesday night. Gloria, this fierce woman in her 50s with silver streaks in her hair and a laugh that filled entire rooms, kept refilling my glass and telling embarrassing stories about difficult clients. By 10:30, most of us were tipsy and warm from the alcohol. That kind of buzzing happiness where everything feels soft around the edges. People started leaving in small groups around 11, calling Ubers and saying long goodbyes in the cold December air out front. I stayed until almost midnight talking to a guy from accounting named Peter, this tall redhead with a gap between his front teeth, who always made me laugh with his terrible puns. When I finally decided to leave, the temperature had dropped significantly, and a bitter wind was cutting through the street like a blade. Instead of walking around the block to where I had parked my car, I made a decision that still haunts me. I figured I would cut through the alley behind the restaurant to save myself 2 minutes in the freezing cold. The alley was darker than I expected. The back of the restaurant had a single floodlight above the kitchen door, but it only illuminated a small circle near the dumpsters, leaving the rest of the passage in deep shadow. I could see the glow of the street on the other end, maybe 50 feet away, and I told myself it was fine. My heels clicked against the wet pavement, echoing off the brick walls in a way that made me suddenly aware of how alone I was. I pulled my coat tighter and walked faster, my breath forming little clouds in front of my face. I was maybe 15 feet into the alley when I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, deliberate, closing the distance. Before I could even turn around, a hand clamped over my mouth from behind and another grabbed my wrist so hard I felt the bones grind together. Someone dragged me sideways, and my ankle twisted as I stumbled, one of my heels snapping clean off. I tried to scream, but the hand pressed harder, and I could taste leather and something metallic, like the person had been handling coins. They shoved me behind the dumpster, into a space that smelled like rotting food and stale grease. A man pressed me against the cold brick wall, his face inches from mine, and in the dim light I could make out a ski mask with holes cut for his eyes and mouth. He was breathing hard, and I could smell cigarettes and something sour on his breath. His grip on my wrist was crushing, and he kept his other hand firmly over my mouth. I heard another voice from the entrance of the alley, low and urgent. Another one from the office party, hurry before more come out. That sentence hit me like a punch to the chest. Another one. They had been waiting, watching us leave the restaurant one by one, picking off whoever wandered away from the group. This was not random. This was not bad luck. These men had planned this, had studied us through the window as we laughed and drank, knowing exactly what they were going to do when we stumbled out into the night. The man holding me yanked at my purse strap so hard it burned across my shoulder before snapping. I heard the contents spill somewhere on the ground, my lipstick rolling away, keys jingling against concrete. He shoved the purse at someone I could not see, and then his hands were on me again, pulling at my coat, patting my pockets. When his fingers found my phone in my jacket, he ripped it out and tossed it behind him. Then he saw my earrings, my grandmother's pearls. He reached for my ear and I did something I did not plan, something that came from a place of pure animal instinct. I bit down on the hand covering my mouth as hard as I could. I tasted blood, felt skin tear between my teeth, and the man screamed and jerked his hand away. For 1 second, maybe 2, his grip loosened and I twisted sideways and started to run. I made it 3 steps before something hard hit the back of my head and the world tilted sideways. I hit the ground on my hands and knees, my palms scraping against broken glass and gravel, pain shooting up my arms. Someone grabbed a fistful of my hair and pulled my head back. The man I had bitten was cursing, calling me names I will not repeat, and I could see blood dripping from his hand onto the pavement. The other one, the lookout, had come into the alley now, and he was younger than I expected. I caught a glimpse of acne scars on his chin below the edge of his mask. He kept looking back toward the street, nervous, bouncing on his feet. "Just get the jewelry and let's go," he hissed. "Someone's gonna come." The first man yanked my head back further and tore one earring out of my ear. The pain was blinding, white hot, and I felt blood running down my neck into my collar. I screamed then, a real scream that echoed off the walls, and the younger one panicked. He grabbed the first man's arm and pulled him toward the back of the alley. Leave it, we gotta go." They took off running, disappearing through a gap in a chain-link fence I had not even noticed was there. And suddenly I was alone, kneeling in garbage and broken glass, bleeding and shaking in the dark. I do not know how long I stayed there. It could have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes. Time had become something fluid and unreliable. Eventually, I managed to get to my feet, using the dumpster to pull myself up, and I stumbled toward the street on one broken heel. My ear was throbbing, blood soaking into the collar of my dress, and I could feel something warm running down my scalp where I had been hit. When I reached the sidewalk, the world seemed too bright, too loud, even though the street was nearly empty. A couple walking their dogs saw me and the woman gasped, pulling out her phone immediately. I must have looked like something out of a horror movie. Mascara streaked down my face, blood on my neck and hands, my coat torn and dirty. The man took off his jacket and wrapped it around my shoulders, asking me questions I could barely process. Someone called 911. Someone else ran into the restaurant to get help. And then Gloria was there, her face pale and terrified, holding my hands and telling me I was going to be okay, that help was coming, that I was safe now. The police arrived before the ambulance. 2 officers, a man and a woman, and they asked me to describe what happened while we waited for the paramedics. I told them everything I could remember, the ski masks, the voices, the phrase about the office party. The female officer's expression changed when I mentioned that. She stepped away and spoke into her radio, and when she came back, she asked me the name of the restaurant and how many people had been at our dinner. I found out later what she had already known. I was the 3rd person attacked that night. A woman named Sandra from our marketing department had been mugged 2 blocks away around 11:15, walking to her car after saying goodbye to everyone. A man named Craig from IT had been jumped near the parking garage at 11:45, beaten badly enough to need stitches above his eye. 3 attacks in less than an hour, all targeting people leaving the same Christmas party. The paramedics loaded me into the ambulance as this information sank in, and I remember staring at the ceiling of that vehicle thinking that none of this felt real, that I would wake up tomorrow and it would all have been some terrible wine-fueled nightmare. At the hospital, a nurse cleaned the wound on my ear where the earring had been ripped out. She told me I was lucky. The lobe had torn but not completely, and it would heal with proper care. Lucky. The word made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. A doctor examined my head, said I had a mild concussion, and told me to have someone wake me every few hours through the night. Gloria stayed with me the whole time, sitting in that plastic chair by the bed, texting updates to our co-workers. Around 3 in the morning, a detective came to take my full statement. His name was Franklin, a tired-looking black man in his 50s with gray at his temples and kind eyes that had seen too much. He told me what the police had pieced together so far. A crew of at least 4 people had been targeting corporate holiday parties downtown for the past 2 weeks. They would scout restaurants with private event rooms, watch the guests through the windows, note the jewelry and expensive coats, and then wait outside for people to leave drunk and alone. They had hit 6 different parties before ours. but this was the first night they had gotten aggressive enough to physically hurt anyone. Something had escalated. Maybe they were getting desperate, or maybe they had just stopped caring about consequences. Detective Franklin asked me if I could identify any of them, and I told him about the acne scars on the younger one's chin, the cigarette smell on the other's breath, the specific way the first man had cursed when I bit him, a slight accent I could not quite place, maybe something Eastern European. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, nodding slowly. Before he left, he gave me his card and told me they would be in touch. I spent the rest of that night at Gloria's apartment because I could not stand the thought of being alone. Her husband made us tea and sat quietly in the living room, while Gloria helped me wash the blood out of my hair in her bathroom sink. I kept catching glimpses of myself in the mirror, the bruise forming on my temple, the bandage on my ear, the hollowness in my eyes, and I did not recognize the woman looking back at me. That confident girl who had done her makeup so carefully just hours before, who had felt so proud of her little black dress and her grandmother's pearls. She was gone. Something had been taken from me in that alley, something beyond the purse and the phone and the jewelry, and I did not know if I would ever get it back. The police caught them 11 days later. Detective Franklin called me on a Saturday morning to tell me that a pawn shop owner had recognized one of my grandmother's earrings, the one they had managed to take, from the description circulated to local businesses. The man who tried to sell it matched the details I had given: stocky build, cigarette smell, and when they pulled him in for questioning, they found bite marks on his hand that were still healing. He gave up his partners within hours trying to cut a deal. There were 5 of them in total, not 4. 2 brothers from Belarus who had overstayed their visas, a local guy with a long record of petty theft, and 2 younger men who served as lookouts and scouts. They had made over $40,000 in 3 weeks hitting holiday parties across the city, preying on people who were too drunk and happy to be cautious. The younger one with the acne scars, a 19-year-old named Victor, actually cried during his arrest and kept saying he never wanted anyone to get hurt. I did not feel sorry for him. I did not feel sorry for any of them. When the assistant district attorney called to tell me they had all taken plea deals and would be serving between 3 and 8 years depending on their level of involvement, I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not even realized was tight. It has been 9 years since that night, and I wish I could say I moved on completely, but that would be a lie. I still do not take shortcuts through alleys. I still get nervous at office parties, always positioning myself near the exit, always watching who comes and goes. The scar on my earlobe faded to a thin white line that most people never notice, but I see it every morning when I put on earrings. Never pearls, not anymore. Gloria retired 2 years ago and we still meet for coffee once a month. She never brings up that night unless I do first, but I know she thinks about it too. Last December, my company had its holiday dinner at a restaurant with valet parking and a security guard at the door, and I caught myself scanning the street outside, looking for anyone who might be watching us through the glass. I know that fear will probably never go away entirely, and I have made peace with that. What happened in that alley taught me something I carry with me now. The world is full of people waiting for you to let your guard down, and sometimes the most dangerous moments come wrapped in celebration and warmth. I survived. Sandra and Craig survived. And every December when the party invitations start arriving, I remind myself that survival is enough, that I am still here, still standing, still refusing to let those 5 minutes in the dark define the rest of my life. Corporate training conferences have a special way of draining your soul, and after 6 straight days of fluorescent lights and PowerPoint slides about logistics optimization, all I wanted was to get home before Christmas. My company had scheduled this regional meeting at our Spokane satellite office with 0 consideration for the fact that some of us would need to cross mountain passes in the dead of winter to get back. I worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company based in Salt Lake City, one of those jobs you fall into after college when your art history degree turns out to be worth less than the paper it was printed on. My graduating class had scattered across the country chasing careers, and here I was 10 years later, spending more time on highways than in my own apartment. That Friday morning, I threw my overnight bag in the back of my Subaru Outback, grabbed the largest coffee the hotel lobby offered, and pointed myself toward Interstate 90 heading south. The December sky hung low and gray, pregnant with snow that the weather app swore would hold off until I was safely through the passes. I believed that little green checkmark more than my own gut, and that choice haunts me still. The first few hours passed without incident, just me and the hum of the heater. A true crime podcast filling the silence as I watched Montana unfold through my windshield. I stopped for gas outside Missoula, standing in a parking lot so cold that my breath crystallized the moment it left my lips, and texted my roommate Jenna that I should roll in around 9 or 10 that night. She responded with a row of Christmas tree emojis and promised her famous spiked hot cocoa would be waiting, the kind with cayenne pepper that warms you from the inside out. I remember smiling at my phone, picturing myself on our worn leather couch with a mug in my hands and my cat Oliver purring on my lap. The highway began its slow climb after Helena, the landscape transforming from flat brown farmland into dense pine forests blanketed in white. The mountains out there have a way of making you feel utterly insignificant, like civilization is just a thin veneer that nature tolerates but could shrug off at any moment. I drove in silence after a while, the podcast abandoned, watching the trees blur past and the road narrow, completely unaware that within 2 hours I would be speeding through ice and darkness, while 3 men sprinted after my car with intentions I still cannot bring myself to fully imagine. The pass I needed to cross was called Lolo, and if you have ever driven it in winter, you know exactly why my stomach tightened as the elevation climbed. The road twists and curves along cliff edges, hugging the mountainside with guardrails that look like they were installed sometime during the Eisenhower administration. Snow had been plowed to the sides, forming walls of dirty white that narrowed the lanes and limited visibility around every bend. I slowed to about 40 miles per hour, my knuckles pale against the steering wheel, watching for black ice on the asphalt. The few cars I had seen earlier seemed to have vanished, and I realized I had not passed another vehicle in at least 20 minutes. Cell service had dropped to nothing somewhere around the last switchback, my phone showing that useless no service message that feels like a death sentence when you are alone in the mountains. I told myself this was fine, that thousands of people drove this pass every winter without incident, that I just needed to focus and take it slow. The shadows from the pines stretched long across the road as the afternoon light began its early winter fade, and I remember thinking how easy it would be to disappear out here, how long it might take anyone to find you. I came around a blind curve doing maybe 35, being extra cautious because the road had started to descend, and I could feel my tires losing grip in patches, when I saw the black SUV parked on the narrow shoulder about 200 feet ahead. Its hazard lights blinked orange against the gray afternoon, and I could see a man standing beside the driver door, waving both arms above his head in that universal gesture of distress. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, and even from that distance I could tell he was looking directly at my approaching headlights. My first instinct, the one drilled into me by years of being a woman who travels alone, was to keep driving. Do not stop for strangers on empty mountain roads, especially when your phone does not work and the nearest town is 40 minutes behind you. But then another thought crept in, the guilty one, the one that whispered about how I would feel reading a news story tomorrow about some poor man who froze to death on Lolo Pass while cars drove by without helping. The temperature outside was hovering around 15 degrees. If his car had broken down, if he had been out there for hours already, he could genuinely be in danger. Slowed down even more, my mind racing through options, and in that hesitation, I made the decision that nearly cost me everything. I pulled onto the shoulder about 30 feet behind the SUV, leaving my engine running and my headlights on because something in the back of my brain was still screaming at me to be careful. The man started walking toward my car immediately, his gait quick and purposeful despite the icy ground, and I noticed he was not shivering at all. That detail registered somewhere deep in my consciousness but did not fully surface until later. He was maybe mid-40s, with a weathered face and a thick beard that had patches of gray near his chin. I cracked my window about 2 inches, just enough to hear him but not enough for a hand to fit through, and called out asking what was wrong. He leaned down to my window level, close enough that I could see his breath fogging the glass, and said his battery had died and his phone was dead too. Asked if I had jumper cables or could give him a ride to the next town. His voice was calm, almost too calm for someone who had supposedly been stranded in freezing temperatures. I was about to tell him I had cables in my trunk when movement in my peripheral vision made every nerve in my body fire at once. 2 figures stepped out from behind the SUV, one from each side, and they were walking toward my car with a speed that had nothing to do with asking for help. The one on the left was carrying something long and metal, a crowbar or a tire iron. I could not tell which, and it did not matter. The one on the right was already at my back door before I could even process what was happening, and I heard the handle click as he yanked it hard. Thank God I had locked my doors automatically when I started driving that morning, a habit my father had drilled into me since I was 16. The man at my window changed completely in that instant, his calm demeanor evaporating into something predatory and cold. He shoved his arm through the gap I had left open, trying to reach the lock or grab my hair, I do not know which. I screamed something, probably just a raw sound of terror, and slammed my foot on the gas pedal without any thought beyond escape. My tires spun on the ice for one horrifying second where nothing happened, where the world seemed to pause and let me understand exactly how trapped I was. Then they caught, and my car lurched forward so violently that the man at my window stumbled backward and fell onto the road. I heard shouting behind me, angry male voices, but I did not look back. I just drove, fishtailing wildly on the frozen asphalt, my entire body trembling so hard I could barely keep the steering wheel straight. The next 10 minutes are a blur of adrenaline and terror that I have tried to piece together dozens of times since. I remember glancing at my rearview mirror and seeing the SUV's headlights flicker on, which meant they were coming after me. The road ahead was nothing but curves and ice and darkness creeping in from the edges of the forest, and I had to make a choice between driving fast enough to stay ahead of them and driving slow enough to not wrap my car around a tree. I pushed the speedometer to 50, then 55, feeling my back end slide with every turn while my headlights carved pale tunnels through the growing dusk. At some point I started crying, not sobbing but just tears streaming down my face while I whispered please, please, please like a prayer to no one. The SUV's headlights appeared behind me on a straight stretch, maybe a quarter-mile back, and I watched them grow larger in my mirror as they closed the distance. They knew this road better than I did. That much was obvious. They knew exactly where to position themselves, exactly which curves would force a good person to stop, and they probably knew exactly how to run someone off a cliff and make it look like an accident. I do not know how long the chase lasted, whether it was 5 minutes or 15, but I remember the exact moment it ended. The road curved sharply to the left, and then opened up into a wider stretch where the trees pulled back from the shoulder. And sitting there like a mirage was a pickup truck with a camper shell parked at a scenic overlook. An older man in an orange hunting vest was standing outside the truck, a cigarette glowing between his fingers as he watched the last light fade over the mountains. I laid on my horn as I approached, a long, continuous blast that made him spin around in alarm, and I pulled off the road so fast that I nearly clipped his front bumper. The SUV behind me did not stop. It flew past the overlook doing at least 60, disappearing around the next curve without even tapping its brakes. I threw my car into park and just sat there, hyperventilating, unable to move as the hunter walked toward my window with a confused and concerned expression on his weathered face. When I finally managed to roll down my window and speak, what came out was barely coherent, just fragments about men and a crowbar and them trying to get into my car. He listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the road behind me, and then he said 4 words that confirmed I had not imagined any of it. "You are not the first." His name was Gene, and he had lived in the area for over 30 years, hunting elk and mule deer in these mountains since before I was born. He told me to stay in my car with the doors locked while he grabbed his rifle from the truck, not because he thought they would come back, but because he wanted me to feel safe. Once he was standing beside my window with a scoped hunting rifle cradled in his arms, he explained what he knew. There had been 4 other incidents on this stretch of road in the past 2 months, all of them following the same pattern. A black SUV with hazard lights, a man waving for help, and then multiple attackers emerging once someone stopped. 2 of the victims had been carjacked and left stranded in the freezing cold, one of them a mother with 2 kids in the back seat who had to walk 3 miles in the snow before finding help. Another victim, a man traveling alone, had been beaten badly when he tried to fight back, his wallet and phone stolen, his car taken and later found burned out on a logging road. The police knew about it, Jean said, but the passes covered multiple jurisdictions, and the attackers never stayed in one spot long enough to be caught. They picked blind curves where drivers had to slow down, places where guilt would override caution, where the human instinct to help someone in trouble became a trap. I sat in my car at that overlook for almost an hour, waiting for my hands to stop trembling enough to drive. Jean refused to leave until he was sure I was okay, standing guard with his rifle while the temperature dropped and stars began to appear in the darkening sky above us. He let me use his satellite phone to call the county sheriff, and I gave a statement right there on the side of the road, describing the 3 men, the SUV, the license plate I had not thought to memorize because I was too busy trying not to die. The deputy on the phone sounded tired but not surprised, and he confirmed what Jean had told me. This crew had been hitting the passes all winter, moving between locations, always targeting solo drivers who looked like they might stop for someone in distress. They asked if I wanted to press charges if they caught them, and I almost laughed at the question. Of course I did. These men had turned basic human decency into a weapon, had exploited the part of us that wants to help strangers, and they had almost certainly done worse things to other people than what they tried to do to me. Before he hung up, the deputy told me something I have never forgotten. He said the woman with the 2 kids, the one who had been carjacked, she only stopped because her son had pointed at the man waving and asked why no one was helping him. She told the police she could not drive past after that, could not let her children see her ignore someone who needed help. Jean followed me down the mountain that night, his headlights a steady presence in my rearview mirror for the next 40 miles until we reached a town with cell service and a gas station, bright enough to feel like civilization again. I hugged him in the parking lot, this stranger with a rifle and a cigarette habit who had probably saved my life just by being in the right place at the right time, and he told me to drive safe and stay smart. I made it home to Salt Lake City around midnight, 6 hours later than I had planned, and Jenna was still awake waiting for me with that spiked hot cocoa she had promised. I did not tell her what happened until the next morning because I could not find the words that night, could only sit on the couch with Oliver purring against my chest and stare at the Christmas tree lights blinking in the corner of our living room. She cried when I told her. I cried too, not from fear anymore, but from the strange delayed realization of how close I had come to becoming one of those stories people share around campfires, one of those unsolved mysteries that haunts a stretch of highway forever. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff's office telling me they had caught the men responsible. An off-duty state trooper had spotted the SUV setting up on a different pass and called it in, and when they ran the plates, it matched a vehicle reported stolen 2 states away. All 3 of them had warrants, long histories of robbery and assault, and one of them was wanted in connection with a missing persons case from the previous spring that was still open. I still drive through mountains when I have to, but something fundamental changed in me after that day on Lolo Pass. I keep my doors locked and my windows up. I never stop for strangers, no matter how guilty it makes me feel, and I carry a satellite communicator in my glove box now for emergencies. Sometimes I wonder about the person they were waiting for after me, whether anyone else stopped that evening before the sun went down completely, whether someone out there was not as lucky as I was. I think about that mother and her kids walking through the snow, about the man who got beaten for trying to fight back, about all the people whose basic goodness was weaponized against them by men who saw compassion as nothing more than opportunity. The worst part is not the fear that lingers, though that is bad enough. The worst part is knowing that a small piece of my faith in humanity got left behind on that frozen road, and I am not sure I will ever get it back. I used to be the kind of person who stopped to help strangers. Now I am the kind of person who drives past and hates herself for it. And every time I see someone on the side of the road with their hazard lights on, waving for help, I feel that war inside me all over again. The guilt pulling one way and the memory of those 3 men pulling the other. And I press the gas pedal a little harder and whisper an apology to whoever they are, real or not, and I keep driving. My buddy Corey and I had been sneaking through the Norfolk Southern freight yard since middle school. By December of 2018, we had graduated from Eastbrook High about 6 months prior and were both stuck in that weird limbo between teenage freedom and actual adulthood, working part-time jobs and figuring out what came next. The yard sat on the edge of our town in eastern Tennessee, a sprawling maze of rusted tracks and forgotten rail cars that nobody seemed to care about anymore. We used it as a shortcut to get from the warehouse district where Corey worked to my neighborhood on the other side. It shaved about 20 minutes off the walk compared to going around on the main roads. That particular night, the first Saturday of December, Corey had finished his shift around 11 and texted me to meet him at our usual spot near the old signal tower. The temperature had dropped to maybe 30 degrees, and our breath came out in thick clouds as we walked between the long rows of freight containers. Holiday lights from the shopping center about a mile away cast this faint orange glow over everything, making the yard look almost peaceful in a strange way. We were maybe halfway through, passing a section where they kept the older boxcars that rarely moved, when Corey grabbed my sleeve and pulled me down. At first I thought he was messing around, but then I heard it too. Voices carrying across the cold air, way too close for comfort. This was unusual because the yard security rarely patrolled this deep, and the homeless folks who sometimes sheltered in the empty cars never talked that loud. We crouched low and duck-walked between 2 rusty grain hoppers, pressing ourselves against the cold metal wheels. From there, we could see a clearing about 50 yards ahead where a string of boxcars sat on a side track. 3 trucks were parked beside them, big unmarked panel vans with their headlights off but engines running. I counted at least 8 figures moving around, all wearing dark clothes and what looked like ski masks or balaclavas. My first thought was that we had stumbled onto some kind of drug deal, which would have been bad enough. But then the side door of one of the boxcars slid open, and everything I understood about the world shifted in a way I still cannot fully explain. 2 men climbed into the boxcar while a third held a flashlight from outside. The beam swept across the interior, and I saw them. People, maybe 6 or 7 of them, slumped against the walls like discarded mannequins. They were dressed in thin clothes completely wrong for December weather, and none of them were moving on their own. One by one, the men started dragging them out, carrying them like sacks of grain toward the waiting vans. Corey's hand found my arm in the dark, his fingers digging in so hard I knew there would be bruises later. We both understood immediately that this was not a drug deal. These were human beings being loaded into vehicles against their will, and the way their heads lolled and their limbs hung limp told me they had been drugged or sedated somehow. I remember the cold metal of the railcar wheel pressing into my back, the smell of diesel and rust, and this horrible feeling of helplessness spreading through my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to call someone, to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. The men worked fast and efficient, like they had done this many times before. They communicated in short bursts, hand signals and whispered commands in a language I could not identify. One of them kept checking his phone, the screen glow briefly illuminating a face that looked weathered and impatient. A woman was passed from the boxcar to the ground, and I noticed her feet were bare despite the freezing temperature. Her hair hung over her face in tangled clumps, and her arms showed dark marks that could have been bruises or dirt. It was hard to tell from where we hid. By now, they had transferred maybe 5 people into the first van, stacking them inside with zero regard for comfort or dignity. I wanted to believe I was dreaming, that I had fallen asleep at home and this was some kind of nightmare fueled by too many crime documentaries. But the cold was too real, the sounds too sharp, the fear too immediate. This was happening 20 feet away from us, and all Corey and I could do was watch and pray they did not look in our direction. That is when one of them woke up. A young guy, maybe around our age or a little older, suddenly jerked his head up as 2 men were carrying him toward the second van. His eyes went wide, and for a split second he seemed completely disoriented. Then pure animal terror took over. He thrashed so hard that he slipped from their grip and hit the gravel on his hands and knees. The men shouted, and the young guy scrambled to his feet and started running. He made it maybe 15 feet before one of the masked figures caught up to him, tackling him from behind with a brutal efficiency that made my stomach turn. I heard the impact, this wet thud of bodies hitting frozen ground, followed by muffled screaming as they pinned him down. Another man jogged over carrying what looked like a syringe, and within seconds the screaming stopped. They picked him up again, limp as before, and continued loading him into the van like nothing had happened. The whole incident lasted maybe 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds burned themselves into my memory with perfect clarity. Corey was breathing so fast I thought he might pass out. I pressed my hand over his mouth, not to silence him, but to ground him somehow, to remind him that we needed to stay invisible. My own heart was slamming against my ribs like it wanted to escape my chest. The young man who had tried to run, I kept seeing his face in that brief moment of consciousness, the way recognition and horror had flooded his features simultaneously. He knew exactly what was happening to him. He knew he was being taken somewhere terrible, and his body had summoned every last ounce of strength to fight back. And it had not mattered. They had caught him in seconds, sedated him again, and now he was just another unconscious body in the back of a van. I thought about my phone, still in my jacket pocket, and how I should be recording this or calling 911. But my brain kept replaying what they had done to that kid, how fast and how ruthless, and I understood with horrible certainty that if they found us hiding here, we would end up in one of those vans too. The whole operation took maybe 20 minutes from when we first hid to when the last van door slammed shut. One of the men walked around the boxcar with a flashlight, checking the ground and the surrounding area. For one terrible moment, the beam swept toward the grain hoppers where we crouched, and I felt Corey stop breathing entirely. The light passed over us without pausing, but I swear it grazed the edge of my sneaker. Then the man turned back, said something to his companions, and climbed into the passenger seat of the lead van. The engines revved, and all 3 vehicles pulled away slowly, their headlights still off as they navigated through the freight yard toward a service road on the far end. We did not move. We stayed pressed against those cold wheels for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes, waiting to make sure they were truly gone and not circling back. The silence that followed their departure was somehow worse than the sounds of what we had witnessed. A heavy, accusatory quiet that seemed to ask why we had not done anything to help. When we finally crawled out from our hiding spot, my legs had gone numb from crouching so long in the cold. Corey vomited against the side of a rail car, this raw heaving sound that echoed across the empty yard. I stood there watching him, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. Neither of us spoke as we made our way home, taking a different route that kept us far from the section where the transfer had occurred. I kept looking behind us, checking shadows, listening for engines. Every car that passed on the main road made me flinch. When I finally got home around 1 in the morning, my mom was asleep and the house was dark. I went straight to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the wall for maybe 2 hours. I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that young man trying to run, saw him hit the ground, saw the syringe. I knew I needed to tell someone, but I had no idea how to explain what we had seen without putting ourselves in danger. Corey called me the next morning, his voice hoarse and shaky. He had not slept either. We talked in circles for almost an hour, going back and forth about what to do. Part of me wanted to go straight to the police, tell them everything, and let them handle it. But Corey pointed out that we had been trespassing when we saw it, that we had no proof, no photos, no license plates, just the word of 2 teenagers who had been cutting through private property at midnight. And there was something else neither of us wanted to say out loud. If these people were organized enough to move human beings through a freight yard like cargo, they were probably organized enough to find out who reported them. We decided to wait a few days, see if anything came up in the news, and then figure out our next move. It was a coward's decision, and I knew it even then. But fear has a way of making cowardice feel like common sense. 4 days later, it was all over the local news. The county sheriff held a press conference announcing that 7 people had been reported missing over the past 2 weeks, all from small towns within a 100-mile radius. Most of them were undocumented immigrants, people who had come looking for work and had no family nearby to notice when they vanished. But one of them was a kid named Marco Delgado, 19 years old, who had been a senior at Eastbrook High the year before Corey and I graduated. I remembered him vaguely, a quiet guy who played trumpet in the marching band and always wore this beat-up denim jacket with patches sewn on the sleeves. When they showed his photo on the news, my entire body went cold. It was him. The young man who had woken up, who had tried to run, who had been tackled and sedated right in front of us. I recognized his face instantly, the shape of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead. Marco Delgado had been 15 feet away from me, fighting for his life, and I had done nothing but hide. That same night, Corey and I went to the police station together. We told them everything: the freight yard, the boxcars, the vans, the masked men, Marco trying to escape. The detective who interviewed us, a tired-looking woman named Russo, listened without interrupting and took notes in a small spiral notebook. She asked us to describe the men, the vehicles, anything we could remember about markings or sounds or smells. We gave her every detail we could recall, which turned out to be a lot more than I expected. Trauma has a way of burning things into your brain whether you want it to or not. When we finished, Detective Russo told us we had done the right thing by coming forward, that our information could help them piece together a larger investigation already underway. She also warned us not to discuss what we had seen with anyone else, not to go back to the freight yard, and to call her directly if we noticed anything unusual. The way she said that last part, if we noticed anything unusual, made it clear that she understood the kind of people we were dealing with, and that our safety was not guaranteed just because we had talked to the cops. The investigation took months, and we were not told much about how it progressed. What I know came from news reports and a brief follow-up meeting with Detective Russo about 3 months later. Federal agents had gotten involved, tracing the trafficking ring across 4 states. They made arrests in Georgia and North Carolina, shutting down a network that had been operating for at least 2 years. Some of the victims were recovered alive, found in labor camps and illegal operations scattered across the Southeast. But Marco Delgado was not among them. His case remains open, listed as a missing person with no confirmed status. I think about him more often than I probably should. That brief moment when he woke up, when he fought back, when he almost made it. I wonder if things would have been different if Corey and I had called 911 right then, if we had been braver or smarter or less afraid. I will never know the answer to that, and I have learned to live with the weight of not knowing. What I do know is that some nights, especially in early December when the air gets cold and sharp, I still hear the sound of engines idling in the dark, and I remember what it felt like to witness something terrible and do nothing at all. Syracuse gets dark early in winter, and I mean dark. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the sky already looks like someone pulled a curtain over the whole city, streetlights flickering on while most people are still finishing their shifts. I worked at a warehouse distribution center on Lakeview Road, sorting packages and loading trucks until my back screamed for mercy, and every evening I walked 6 blocks to catch the 5:47 bus on Caldwell Avenue. The stop itself was nothing special, just a metal shelter with a cracked plastic bench, wedged between an abandoned dry cleaner and a storage facility surrounded by chain-link fence. Most of my coworkers had cars, waving goodbye from the parking lot while I zipped up my jacket and started the walk. Having graduated high school back in 2011, I always thought my life would look different by now. But there I was, riding public transit in the freezing cold, saving every dollar for an apartment with radiators that clanked and groaned like something was trapped inside the walls. I first noticed the car on a Wednesday, the first week of that month. A dark blue sedan, older model, maybe a Ford Taurus or something similar, parked across the street from the bus shelter with its engine off. Someone sat behind the wheel, just a shape against the faint glow of a phone screen. I barely registered it at first. People wait and parked cars all the time for 100 different reasons. Picking up family members, killing time, avoiding conversations at home. I checked the transit app on my phone and saw 7 minutes until arrival, so I stamped my feet to keep warm and watched my breath form little clouds that vanished into the cold air. When I looked up again, the silhouette inside the sedan had shifted. The person was no longer looking at their phone. Their head was turned toward the bus shelter, toward me, just sitting there motionless behind the glass. A delivery truck rumbled past and blocked my view for a moment, and when it cleared, nothing had changed. Same car, same figure, same unsettling stillness. I told myself it was nothing, and got on the bus when it arrived, forgetting about the whole thing before I even reached my stop. Thursday came and went without incident, mostly because I had to stay late for inventory, and missed my usual bus by almost an hour. By the time I reached Caldwell Avenue, the street was emptier than usual, the cold keeping everyone indoors, and the sedan was nowhere in sight. I remember feeling relieved without fully understanding why, like some part of my brain had flagged that car as a problem even though I had consciously dismissed it. Friday was different. I left work at my normal time, walked the same 6 blocks, and there it was again. Parked in the exact same spot across the street. Same dark blue sedan, same tinted windows, same figure behind the wheel. This time the engine was running, a thin trail of exhaust curling up into the frozen air, and the headlights were off even though the sun had already set. I stood under the bus shelter and pretended to scroll through my phone, but my eyes kept drifting back to that car. The figure inside did not move, did not check their phone, did not do anything except sit there facing my direction. 5 minutes passed, then 6. I could feel my pulse in my throat, which sounds dramatic, but you have to understand how isolated that bus stop was. No pedestrians, no other cars, just me and that sedan, and the buzz of a failing streetlight above my head. The bus finally arrived and I climbed on fast, tapping my transit card without looking back. I found a seat near the middle and glanced out the window as we pulled away from the curb. The sedan had not moved. But right before we turned the corner, I saw something that made my chest tight. The driver's side door had cracked open, just a few inches, like whoever was inside had been about to get out. The interior light did not turn on, which meant they had disabled it, and that detail stuck with me for the rest of the night. Why would someone disable their dome light unless they did not want to be seen? I told myself I was being paranoid, that I watched too many crime documentaries, that this was just some random person with a broken car light. But when I got home to my apartment, I locked the deadbolt and the chain, something I had not done in months. I even pushed my small kitchen table against the door, feeling ridiculous the whole time but unable to stop myself. That night I barely slept, staring at the ceiling and listening to the radiator clank, while my mind replayed the image of that door cracking open in the darkness. Saturday and Sunday offered a break from the routine, and I spent most of the weekend convincing myself that I had exaggerated the whole situation. By Monday morning, the fear had faded into something more like embarrassment. I even laughed about it while making coffee, shaking my head at how easily I had let my imagination spiral out of control. Just some guy waiting for someone, probably annoyed that I kept staring at his car like a paranoid freak. I went to work with a lighter mood, joking around with my coworker April during our lunch break, telling her about the creepy sedan as if it were a funny story instead of something that had kept me awake for 2 nights. She laughed and said I had been watching too much true crime, which is exactly what I needed to hear. The day passed quickly, and by the time 5 o'clock rolled around, I had almost completely forgotten about the whole thing. Almost. Because when I stepped outside the warehouse and started walking toward Caldwell Avenue, I felt a small knot form in my stomach, a tension I could not fully explain. The sun was already gone, the sky a deep purple bleeding into black, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since morning. I saw the sedan before I even reached the bus stop. Same spot, same position, same dark blue paint catching the glow of the distant streetlight. My steps slowed without me deciding to slow them, my body reacting before my brain could catch up. The engine was running again, that thin wisp of exhaust floating up into the cold, and this time I noticed something new. The passenger side window was down about 2 inches, despite the freezing temperature outside. I kept walking because stopping felt worse somehow, like it would confirm that I was afraid, that I had a reason to be afraid. When I reached the shelter, I did not sit on the cracked plastic bench. I stood near the edge closest to the street, positioning myself where I could see the sedan clearly and where the bus would block me from view as soon as it arrived. The figure behind the wheel was there, same as before, just a dark shape that never seemed to move. But then something changed. A sound cut through the quiet, faint but unmistakable. A car door opening. Not all the way, just that initial click and creak of hinges. I looked directly at the sedan and saw the driver's side door push outward a few inches, then stop. Whoever was inside was testing something, maybe checking if I would react, maybe waiting to see if anyone else was around. I pulled out my phone and pretended to make a call, holding it to my ear and speaking to no one on the other end. I said things like, "Yeah, I'm at the bus stop now, and okay, see you in a few minutes," hoping that whoever sat in that sedan would hear me, would think someone was expecting me, would decide I was not worth the risk. The door stayed cracked open the entire time, neither closing nor opening further, and I could feel eyes on me even though I could not see them through the tinted glass. My heart was pounding so hard I worried the person might somehow hear it across the street. 2 minutes until the bus, according to my app. I kept the fake conversation going, laughing at nothing, nodding along to silence, doing everything I could to seem like a person with connections, with people who would notice if something happened to me. A car drove past on Caldwell Avenue, and the sedan door clicked shut, fast and quiet, like a reflex. I watched the blue car sit there motionless again, engine still running, and I understood something clearly for the first time. This was not random. This was not coincidence. Someone had been watching me, learning my schedule, waiting for the right moment when the street was empty enough and the darkness thick enough to do whatever they were planning to do. The bus arrived and I practically threw myself through the doors, scanning my card and walking straight to the back where I could see out the rear window. As we pulled away, I watched the sedan. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the headlights flicked on, and the car slowly pulled out of its parking spot. It did not follow the bus, not exactly, but it drove in the same direction, turning left where we turned left, maintaining a distance of about half a block. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to see the license plate, but the angle was wrong and the streetlights too dim. The sedan followed for 3 more blocks before it turned off onto a side street and disappeared. I sat back in my seat, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. When I got off at my usual stop, I did not walk straight home. Instead, I went into the convenience store on the corner and stayed there for 20 minutes, pretending to browse the aisles while watching the street through the window. No blue sedan, no one suspicious. Just the normal flow of evening traffic and pedestrians bundled up against the cold. I bought a bag of chips I did not want and finally walked home, checking behind me every few steps until I reached my building. That night I called my older brother Jeff, who lived about 40 minutes away in a suburb outside the city. He worked as an electrician and had that practical, no-nonsense attitude that made me feel stupid for even bringing it up. but I told him everything anyway. The sedan, the figure behind the wheel, the door cracking open, the way the car had followed the bus. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished, which surprised me because I expected him to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, he asked me specific questions. What color was the car exactly? Did I notice any dents or stickers or anything distinctive? What time did I usually get to the bus stop? Had I noticed anyone else being watched? I answered as best I could, and when I finished, he told me to start taking pictures. Document everything, he said. Get the license plate if I could. And most importantly, he told me to call the police and file a report, even if they could not do anything right away. Having something on record mattered, he explained, in case things escalated. I promised I would, and after we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling a strange mix of validation and terror. My brother had taken me seriously, which meant this was serious, which meant I was not imagining the danger I felt every time I stood at that bus stop alone in the dark. I called the non-emergency police line the next morning before work and explained the situation to an officer who sounded tired but not dismissive. She took down the details, the location, the description of the car, the times I had seen it, and told me they would make a note in their system. She also suggested I vary my routine if possible, take a different bus, get picked up by someone, avoid being alone at that stop during the evening hours. I thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly better but also frustrated. Vary my routine. Easy to say when you have options, when you have a car or flexible hours or someone who can drive you. I had none of those things. My shift ended at 5 every day. The 5:47 was the only bus that got me home at a reasonable hour, and asking Jeff to pick me up every evening was not realistic. So I went to work, did my job, and when 5 o'clock came, I walked toward Caldwell Avenue with my phone already in my hand, camera app open, heart beating faster with every step. The sedan was there. Same spot, same silence. But this time, I was ready. I raised my phone and took 3 pictures in quick succession, zooming in on the license plate as much as I could without the image turning into a blurry mess. The figure inside the car must have noticed because the sedan suddenly pulled forward, not fast but deliberate, rolling out of the parking spot and down the street away from me. I kept taking pictures as it moved, capturing the rear of the vehicle, the shape of the taillights, anything that might help identify it later. My hands were steady even though everything inside me was screaming. The car turned right at the end of the block and vanished from sight, and I stood there under the bus shelter feeling like I had won something small but important. I had proof now. I had evidence that this was real, that someone had been watching me, that I was not crazy. When I got home, I emailed the photos to myself, saved them to my cloud storage, and sent copies to Jeff along with a message explaining what happened. He replied within minutes telling me to send everything to the police as well, which I did. The officer I had spoken to earlier called me back that evening and said they would run the plates and see what came up. She sounded more interested now, more alert, and she asked if I could come into the station the next day to give a formal statement. I agreed without hesitation. Wednesday morning, I went to the police station before my shift and sat across from a detective named Howell, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses that she kept pushing up her nose. She showed me a photograph on her computer screen and asked if I recognized the vehicle. It was the blue sedan, no question, and I told her so immediately. She nodded and then told me something that made the room feel smaller. The car belonged to a man named Ronald Pratt, 47 years old. No permanent address, with a record that included assault, harassment, and a previous arrest for attempted abduction in another state 8 years ago. He had been released on parole 2 years prior and had recently been spotted in multiple locations around the city, always near bus stops, always during the early evening hours when the sun went down and the streets emptied out. I was not his only target, she explained. 3 other people had filed similar reports over the past month, all describing the same car, the same behavior, the same feeling of being watched and tested. The detective thanked me for coming forward and for the photos, which had given them the clearest image of his plates they had received so far. She told me they were actively looking for him now, and she advised me to stay vigilant until they made an arrest. For the next 4 days, Jeff picked me up after work. He would pull into the warehouse parking lot at 5:15, and I would climb into his truck and feel something close to normal for the 20 minutes it took him to drop me home. I hated needing help, hated feeling like I could not handle my own life, but I also knew that pride was not worth dying over. The bus stop on Caldwell Avenue stayed empty those evenings, at least from what I could see as we drove past. No blue sedan, no figure watching from behind tinted glass. Maybe Pratt had moved on to another part of the city. Maybe he knew the police were closing in and decided to lay low. I checked the local news obsessively, scrolling through articles on my phone during lunch breaks and before bed, waiting for something, anything that would tell me this nightmare was over. On Sunday night, I finally found it. A short article buried in the crime section reported that a man had been arrested near a bus stop on the east side of Syracuse after a witness called 911 to report suspicious behavior. The suspect, identified as Ronald Pratt, was taken into custody without incident and was being held on multiple charges including stalking, harassment, and violation of parole. The article mentioned that police believed he was connected to a string of incidents targeting individuals at isolated transit stops throughout the city during the early weeks of December. I read that article probably 15 times before I let myself believe it was real. Jeff called me that night after seeing the same news, and neither of us said much, just sat on the phone in silence for a while, breathing, processing. I went back to taking the bus the following Monday. Same route, same time. Same cracked plastic bench under the flickering streetlight. The sedan was gone. The parking spot across the street sat empty, just a patch of asphalt where something terrible had almost happened but did not. I still think about those evenings sometimes, standing alone in the cold while someone watched me from behind dark glass, calculating, waiting. I think about how easily things could have gone differently, how one night without witnesses or one delayed bus might have changed everything. People always say to trust your instincts, and I used to roll my eyes at that kind of advice, but not anymore. My body knew something was wrong before my brain caught up, and the only reason I am writing this now instead of being another name in a news article is because I listened. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Document everything. Tell someone. Do not let anyone make you feel stupid for being afraid. Fear kept me alive, and I will never apologize for that. Divorce has a way of making you crave silence. After 18 months of lawyers, arguments, and dividing everything from furniture to friendships, the idea of spending Christmas week completely alone felt less like loneliness and more like a reward. My co-worker Denise practically begged me to join her church potluck, and my landlord even mentioned a community dinner at the recreation center, but I turned down every invitation without a second thought. The townhouse complex where I lived sat on the outskirts of Tucson, one of those newer developments where every unit looked identical. Beige stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, and a tiny backyard barely big enough for a grill and 2 lawn chairs. My place was the last unit on the east side, which meant I only shared one wall with my neighbor, an elderly man named Howard, who spent winters visiting his daughter in Seattle. His place had been dark and empty since early December. The unit across the small parking lot belonged to a young couple who had loaded up their SUV on the 22nd and driven off to spend the holidays with family somewhere in Texas. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, I was essentially alone in my little corner of the development, and that suited me just fine. The first 2 days of my vacation passed exactly as I had planned. Lazy mornings, long baths, and enough chocolate to put myself into a pleasant sugar coma. My graduating class from northern Arizona had scattered across the country years ago, so there was nobody local expecting me anywhere, nobody checking in, nobody wondering what I was doing at any given moment. December 23rd fell on a Monday that year. and I had taken the entire week off from my job at the insurance agency downtown. The main cluster of townhouses sat about 200 feet away from my unit, separated by a row of decorative desert landscaping and a curved walking path. I could see their Christmas lights twinkling in the distance from my kitchen window, but they felt miles away from my quiet little corner. That night, Christmas Eve, I made myself a simple dinner of pasta and garlic bread, poured a generous glass of Merlot, and settled onto my couch to watch some cooking competition show. The temperature outside had dropped into the low 40s, which counts as freezing by Arizona standards, and I remember feeling grateful for my thick wool socks and the blanket draped across my lap. The house was warm, the wine was good, and for the first time in almost 2 years, I felt something close to peace. The cooking show had just ended, and I was debating whether to open a second bottle of wine or call it an early night when I noticed the living room get slightly darker. It took me a moment to realize what had changed. The soft glow from my outdoor Christmas lights, the ones I had strung along the front porch railing, had disappeared. I glanced at the clock on my cable box and saw it was just past midnight. Officially Christmas Day now. My first thought was that the timer had malfunctioned, but I distinctly remembered setting it to stay on until 2 in the morning. I figured a fuse must have blown, which would not have surprised me given how old the electrical panel in these townhouses was. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept in my kitchen junk drawer and headed toward the front door, already mentally cursing the inconvenience of having to dig through the utility closet in the dark. But as I passed by the front window, I stopped. Through the gap between my living room blinds, I could see the parking lot bathed in the pale yellow glow of the complex street lamp, and crossing through that light, moving slowly along the front of my townhouse, was a shadow. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone from the main cluster of townhouses was taking a late-night walk, or perhaps a neighbor I did not know had come home for the holiday after all. But the shadow stopped directly in front of my window. Just stood there, a dark silhouette against the faint light, completely motionless. I could not make out any features through the blinds, just the general shape of a person, tall and broad-shouldered, facing my unit. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I backed away from the window slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, and pressed myself against the wall next to my bookshelf. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an innocent explanation, that I was overreacting because of the wine and the late hour, and the fact that I had been watching too many true crime documentaries lately. But something deep in my gut, some ancient instinct that exists in all of us, was screaming at me that this was wrong. I stood there in the darkness of my living room, barely breathing, watching that shadow through the thin gaps in my blinds, waiting for it to move, to leave, to do anything except stand there staring at my home. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 2 or 3 minutes. Then, without any warning, it moved. Not away from my townhouse, but around the side, disappearing from my line of sight toward the narrow alley that ran between my unit and Howard's empty place. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a homeless person looking for shelter, or a drunk who had wandered into the wrong complex, or even some teenager playing a stupid prank on Christmas Eve. I told myself to calm down, to think rationally, but my body refused to listen. I crept through my living room toward the back of the house, staying low, keeping away from the windows. My townhouse had a small back patio with a sliding glass door that led out to the tiny yard, and beyond that was nothing but empty desert scrubland and a wooden fence that marked the edge of the property. I had always loved that fence because it gave me privacy, but now all I could think about was how isolated I was back here, how far away from the other units, how nobody would hear me if I screamed. I reached the kitchen and peered around the corner toward the back door, straining my ears for any sound from outside. That is when I heard it, the soft metallic click of someone testing the handle on my back door. Not a knock, not a voice calling out, just the slow, deliberate sound of the handle being pushed down and released, over and over again. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making any noise, and watched the handle move in the dim light that filtered through the kitchen window. The motion was patient, almost rhythmic, and I realized with horror that whoever was out there was timing their attempts with the sound of cars passing on the main road about a quarter-mile away. Every time a vehicle drove by, creating that low hum of tires on asphalt, the handle would turn. They were using the noise to mask what they were doing, which meant this was not some confused stranger or random drunk. This was someone who had thought about this, planned this, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. My phone was on the coffee table in the living room, and the distance between me and that phone felt like miles. I waited for another car to pass, and when the handle turned again, I used the sound to cover my footsteps as I moved back toward the living room as quietly as I could. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and immediately dialed 911, my fingers trembling so badly that I had to try twice to hit the right numbers. The operator picked up after 2 rings, a woman with a calm professional voice who asked me to state my emergency. I whispered as quietly as I could, telling her someone was trying to break into my house, giving her my address, explaining that I was alone. She asked me to stay on the line and assured me that officers were being dispatched, but then her voice changed. It dropped lower, more urgent, and she told me something that made my entire body go cold. She said she needed me to stay very quiet because there was background noise on my call, breathing, heavy and close, like someone was listening in on another line. For a moment, I did not understand what she meant. I only had one phone, a cell phone, and I was the only person in the house. Then the realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Whoever was outside had somehow accessed my call, was somehow hearing everything I was saying to the dispatcher. The operator whispered for me to move to the most secure room in my house and barricade the door, to not say another word, to just listen for the sirens. I ended the call against her instructions because I could not stand the thought of that breathing on the line, of him hearing my location, my fear, everything. I ran to my bedroom at the back of the townhouse and locked the door behind me, then dragged my heavy wooden dresser in front of it with a strength I did not know I possessed. My bedroom had one window that faced the backyard, and I made sure the blinds were completely shut before I crouched down in the corner between my bed and the closet. The silence in the house was suffocating. I strained to hear any sound, footsteps, the handle turning again, glass breaking, but there was nothing. Just the distant hum of the occasional car on the main road and the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like hours. I kept checking my phone, watching the time crawl forward, wondering how long it would take for the police to arrive in this remote corner of the city on Christmas morning. Then I heard something that nearly stopped my heart, a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the front of the house. It was not the sound of someone trying to force a door open. It was lighter, more controlled, like metal against wood. The scraping continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped, then started again, then stopped. The pattern repeated 3 or 4 times before everything went silent once more. I sat in that corner, arms wrapped around my knees, praying for the sound of sirens. The sirens came about 12 minutes after I had hung up, though it felt like I had aged a decade in that time. I heard the cars pull into the complex, saw the faint flash of red and blue lights through my bedroom blinds, and finally allowed myself to breathe. There were voices outside, loud and authoritative, calling out commands and announcing their presence. I stayed in my room until I heard a knock on my front door, and a man identifying himself as Officer Hartley with the Tucson Police Department. Even then, I made him slide his badge under my bedroom door before I would move the dresser and come out. He was a tall man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and kind eyes that immediately made me feel safer. His partner, a younger woman named Reeves, was outside examining the perimeter of my townhouse with a flashlight. Officer Hartley sat me down on my couch and asked me to walk him through everything that had happened, and I told him all of it. The lights going out, the shadow at my window, the handle turning in rhythm with the passing cars, the breathing on the phone line. He listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather pad, his expression growing more serious with each detail I shared. Officer Reeves came inside a few minutes later, and the look on her face told me she had found something. She asked Officer Hartley to step outside with her, and through my front window I watched them examining my porch with their flashlights, crouching down, pointing at things I could not see from where I sat. When they came back inside, Officer Hartley sat down across from me and told me what they had discovered. The outdoor Christmas lights had not blown a fuse. Someone had deliberately unscrewed the bulbs, carefully enough that none of them were broken, just loosened in their sockets so they would not turn on. Along the doorframe of my back door, they had found fresh scratch marks in the wood, deep grooves that suggested someone had been trying to pry the door open with some kind of tool, maybe a flathead screwdriver or a crowbar. The scraping sound I had heard from my bedroom was likely the same person working on my front door. Officer Reeves said the marks were methodical, not frantic, which indicated someone who knew what they were doing and was taking their time. They asked me if I had any enemies, any ex-partners who might want to harm me, anyone who had been bothering me recently. I thought of my ex-husband immediately, but he had moved to Chicago 8 months ago and had no reason to come back. The officers stayed with me for over an hour, taking photographs of the damage, dusting for fingerprints, and canvassing the empty units nearby for any sign of the intruder. They found footprints in the soft dirt behind my backyard fence, size 11 work boots based on the tread pattern, leading out into the desert scrubland and disappearing about 50 yards from my property. Whoever it was had parked somewhere out there in the darkness, walked in on foot, and vanished the same way when the sirens approached. Officer Hartley explained that this kind of behavior, the careful planning, the timing with traffic noise, the methodical approach to entry, suggested someone who had done this before. He did not say the word serial, but I could see it in his eyes, the way he and Reeves exchanged glances when they thought I was not looking. They offered to have a patrol car sit outside my complex for the rest of the night, and I accepted without hesitation. Before they left, Officer Reeves pulled me aside and said something that has stayed with me ever since. She said I was lucky that I had noticed the lights going out. Lucky that I had looked through the blinds at that exact moment. Lucky that I had called when I did. She said most people in my situation would have just gone to check the fuse box outside, would have walked right out their front door into the darkness without a second thought. The implication was clear. If I had done that, I might not be standing here talking to her. I did not sleep that night, or the next night, or the one after that. I stayed with Denise from work for the rest of the holiday week, too terrified to set foot in my townhouse alone. In January, I broke my lease and moved to a gated apartment complex on the other side of the city, closer to downtown, where there were people and lights and noise at all hours. The police never caught whoever was outside my home that Christmas Eve. They found a partial fingerprint on one of the loosened light bulbs, but it did not match anyone in their database. Officer Hartley called me a few times over the following months to check in, and during one of those calls, he mentioned that there had been 2 similar incidents in the area over the past year, both involving women living alone in isolated units, both occurring late at night, both showing the same methodical approach to entry. In neither case had the intruder actually gotten inside. He said they had a theory that whoever this was enjoyed the hunt more than the capture, that watching the fear, testing the doors, hearing the panic in a 911 call might be the entire point. I still think about that sometimes, about the fact that he might have been listening to me beg for help, breathing into my phone, savoring every trembling word. I installed a security system in my new apartment, bought a baseball bat that I keep next to my bed, and I never, ever spend a holiday alone anymore. Some lessons you only need to learn once. Crowds were still spilling out of the park when I finally found a quieter corner to breathe. My friends had already peeled off with their partners, and I just wanted to get home and get my shoes off. I remember feeling that mix of post-fireworks buzz and exhaustion, the kind that makes everything feel slightly unreal, but not in a bad way. I opened my rideshare app, saw the wait time, and leaned against a metal barricade that someone had half crushed earlier in the night. The air still smelled like burnt powder and kettle corn, and people were laughing, stumbling, calling out to each other as they tried to reconnect in the chaos. I was sober, just tired, and trying to shake off the leftover adrenaline from the fireworks. My driver's car was listed as a charcoal sedan, pretty common, so I kept checking the little GPS dot, creeping closer. A few minutes passed before a charcoal sedan rolled up to the curb with its window halfway down. The driver leaned over and called my name, calmly, like he'd said it 1,000 times. That threw me off more than anything, because I hadn't even seen him clearly yet. He had a baseball cap pulled low, and the streetlights were doing that annoying strobe effect as people walked in front of us, blocking the glow every few seconds. I glanced at the car, same color, same make, and for a second I almost opened the door, but something nudged me to double-check the plate. It was close, incredibly close, but the last digit wasn't right. One number off, not a typo off, like a completely different digit. I asked him about it, trying to keep my voice casual. His reaction snapped something inside me. Instead of just correcting me or explaining, he sighed loudly and waved me toward the door like I was being dramatic. He muttered something about the street being a disaster and how he couldn't sit here all night, and his tone carried this irritated edge that felt too personal for someone I'd never met. People were squeezing past us, brushing against my shoulders, and the noise around me felt heavier suddenly. Not louder, just harder to filter. I took one step back, then another, and his expression shifted in this way I can only describe as annoyed that I wasn't cooperating with whatever script he thought I was following. He tapped the door impatiently and told me to get in unless I wanted to be stuck there another hour. Before I could even answer, another charcoal sedan rolled up behind him and idled. This driver rolled his window down and called my name too, but his voice matched the one on the app's profile clip. He held up his phone, screen glowing with my ride details. The first driver looked into his mirror, then shot me this sharp look, like I'd inconvenienced him on purpose. Without another word, he jerked the wheel and sped off, headlights off, slipping through the crowd in a way no sober person would ever attempt. A couple walking nearby jumped out of the way, shouting after him, but he didn't slow down. He just disappeared into the mess of brake lights and drifting smoke like he'd practiced that exit 100 times. I got into the real car, still trying to process how close I'd come to stepping into the wrong one. My actual driver, a guy named Marcus, kept glancing at me in the mirror with this concerned look, the kind you give someone who's clearly rattled but trying not to make a scene. He asked if everything was all right, and I told him what happened in a short, jumbled version. The moment I mentioned the missing digit on the plate, he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He said other passengers earlier in the night had mentioned cars lingering near pickup zones, matching descriptions almost perfectly. Same make, same color, sometimes even the same aftermarket decals. Hearing that made my whole body tense up. The streets were choked with people leaving the fireworks, and every minute we crawled forward gave me more space in my head to replay the man's tone, the way he said my name with too much familiarity, like he'd practiced it. By the time we cleared the traffic and merged into quieter blocks, the excitement of the holiday felt like it belonged to a different day entirely. I kept checking the rear window even when I knew logically he wasn't behind us. Marcus tried to lighten the mood by talking about his plans to quit driving after the holiday rush, but even he couldn't hide how uneasy he seemed. At one point he said something that stuck with me. If someone's going through all that trouble to mimic a ride, they're not doing it for anything good. The thought of that made my throat tighten. I rolled down the window a crack to get some cold air, but even the breeze didn't help settle my nerves. Every charcoal sedan we passed made my chest tighten like I was seeing the same car again and again. When we reached my street, Marcus didn't pull away right after dropping me off. He waited until I was through the gate of my building before waving goodbye, something drivers almost never do anymore. Inside my apartment, the silence felt heavier than usual. My neighbors were still out celebrating, so the hallway was empty, and every little creak sounded too sharp. I put on water for tea just to have some noise, but even that didn't stop the jittery feeling running through me. My phone buzzed with a safety notification from the rideshare app, asking if I'd arrived safely. I clicked yes, then hesitated, staring at the little customer support icon. Part of me felt ridiculous reporting something that hadn't technically happened, but the other part kept replaying the man's impatient tone and how quickly he tore off once the real car arrived. Eventually, I hit the report button and typed everything out. I didn't expect much, maybe a generic response, but a few minutes later my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman from the company's safety team asking if she could ask a few follow-up questions. Her voice was steady, but there was a seriousness underneath it that made me sit down. She confirmed that the car I described didn't match any registered driver in the area. Worse, 2 other riders had called earlier about similar incidents, though in their cases the fake drivers bailed before anyone could confront them. Hearing that made my palms go damp in an instant. The woman gently suggested I contact the police because the behavior matched a pattern they'd been alerted to. I called the non-emergency line because I didn't want to blow things out of proportion. But the moment I described the missing digit on the plate and the way the guy had said my name, the dispatcher's tone sharpened. She transferred me to an officer who asked for every detail I could remember. The cap, the angle he held his arm on the window frame, the way he kept glancing at the sidewalk instead of at me. While I talked, I paced around my living room, stopping every time I realized I didn't actually want to be near the windows. The officer said they had already increased patrols near the event area after multiple women reported drivers acting strangely or circling the same blocks repeatedly. He asked if I could come in the next day to give a formal statement. I agreed, even though I barely slept after hanging up. At the station the following afternoon, the detective I spoke with laid out photos of different sedans, each one circled on maps showing their paths around the event zone. He pointed out patterns I wouldn't have noticed: cars looping the same alleys, pulling into lots then backing out immediately, hovering at pickup points with no assigned ride. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell from his expression that my encounter wasn't unusual that night. The fireworks had drawn out tens of thousands of people, and many were tipsy, distracted, or separated from their groups. Perfect conditions for someone looking to blend in and pick a target. The detective said one woman had actually gotten into a fake car earlier, but managed to jump out at a stoplight when she realized the driver was taking a route that didn't match her app. Walking home after giving my statement, I kept replaying how easily things could have gone in a different direction for me. The detective had explained that these men, or maybe it was just one group pretending to be multiple drivers, had refined their approach by watching how real rideshares interacted with riders. The greeting by name, the quick wave, the casual impatience. They had the script nailed down. That detail haunted me more than anything. They weren't improvising. They were practicing, planning, perfecting. My street felt different as I approached my building. Still familiar, but edged with the thought that danger doesn't always show up wearing something obvious or theatrical. Sometimes it looks exactly like what you're expecting. A few days later, the detective called to tell me they'd made progress. Surveillance caught the same sedan from my description weaving recklessly through a pedestrian crossing not long after it left me at the curb. They traced the car to an abandoned property on the outskirts of the city, but whoever had been using it had cleared out fast. No personal items, no gear, just a stack of fake plates in a cardboard box and tire marks in the dirt. The detective told me very plainly that I'd made the right call by stepping back and waiting for plate confirmation. He said that small hesitation likely kept me from becoming part of their pattern. I still think about that night whenever I leave a crowded event. How one missing digit saved me from stepping into a car, meant for someone who wasn't supposed to come back. Staying home alone that December felt strange from the start, mostly because the house always felt louder when it was just me. My wife and kids had flown out 2 days earlier to visit her parents, and I stayed behind because of work. I remember thinking that the place seemed bigger without them, like the walls carried every little sound a bit too clearly. That night, the temperature had dropped fast, and the air inside felt sharper than usual, even with the heater running. I'd gone to bed later than I should have, scrolling through old photos of the kids decorating the tree the week before. Nothing felt out of the ordinary when I finally drifted off. Just the usual quiet of a cold night settling in around me. Sometime deep in the night, a noise pulled me out of sleep. A steady series of crunches, the kind snow makes when someone heavy walks across it. At first, I brushed it off as a deer or maybe a stray dog wandering near the yard. But it kept going, slow and deliberate, like whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. I sat up in the dark, listening, and the rhythm of the steps felt too purposeful to ignore. The sound moved closer to my bedroom window, not rushing, not stopping, just approaching like someone who knew exactly where they were going. I grabbed my phone and opened the porch camera feed out of habit, expecting to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. Instead of the usual grainy view of the front steps, the screen showed nothing but a cloudy blur, like the lens had been smeared with something thick. Not fog, not condensation, something that looked dragged across the glass by fingertips. That was the moment my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the night my son wandered out of bed with a fever years ago. I got up quietly and moved through the hallway, every floorboard sounding louder than it ever had. The wind had kicked up outside, brushing frost against the siding, but beneath it I could still make out faint shifts in the snow. I stopped at the top of the stairs, trying to figure out if calling the police right then would help or just waste precious minutes. Then the testing started. A soft push against the kitchen window followed by a faint rattle of the latch. Whoever it was took their time, moving from one ground floor window to the next, as if checking them off a list. I could hear the faint scrape of a gloved hand sliding along the glass before each attempt. The pattern was so methodical it made my mouth go dry. I backed into the hallway, keeping the phone against my ear as I finally dialed 911. Whispering to the operator while trying not to make any noise that might give away where I was. The minutes stretched, each sound downstairs feeling like it was happening right beside me, and all I could do was wait for help while the intruder circled the house like they had all night to spare. The operator assured me officers were on the way, but with the holiday calls stacking up, she couldn't give me a clear estimate. I stayed crouched at the top of the stairs, listening as the intruder reached the sunroom windows. That one had an old metal frame, and the sound of the person pressing against it carried through the entire house. The way they moved made it feel like they'd studied the layout beforehand, lingering longer at the windows that were easier to unlatch, barely tapping the ones I always kept locked tight. At one point, the movement paused long enough that I thought maybe they'd left, but then a soft thump came from directly beneath me, right by the basement hatch that opened to the backyard. I felt a dull ache pulse through my arms as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. When the person finally reached the back door, the handle gave a slow metallic creak as if they were testing how much pressure it would take before it snapped. I kept replaying the smeared camera lens in my head, realizing whoever this was had gotten close enough, calm enough, to touch the camera without fear of being recorded. Every couple of seconds, the intruder stepped away from the door only to return for another attempt, like they were trying to match their movements with passing gusts of wind. The absurd part is that I kept glancing at the thermostat across the room, watching the temperature drop inside the house as if it could tell me how close the person was. I sent my wife a quick text saying everything was fine, even though the last thing I felt was fine. Eventually, the footsteps drifted toward the front of the house again, but this time slower, heavier, like the person wanted me to hear them. They brushed past the living room window, their shadow crossing the faint glow from the street lamp. I couldn't make out the shape clearly, but it was tall, broader than any of my neighbors, and moving with a steadiness that made my throat tighten. Right then, a loud crack sounded outside, not from my house, but from farther up the street. Maybe someone set off a firework, or maybe ice snapped on a branch. Whatever it was, it made the person outside stop. I held my breath and waited for the next sound, but it never came. Instead, the footsteps faded, disappearing into the snow as if they'd simply dissolved into the night. By the time the officers arrived, the house had gone silent again. I met them at the door, trying to explain everything while they swept the yard with their flashlights. The beam caught a full trail of footprints circling the entire property, looping around the porch, the windows, even the garage door. The strangest part was how the tracks ended. They didn't trail off naturally or fade into the distance. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the road, right beside tire marks that cut a deep line through the frozen slush. One of the officers pointed out how clean the prints looked, like the person had been standing there for a long time before walking up to the house. The idea that someone had parked there watching me, hours before even taking a step toward the yard, made my mouth go dry. The officers did one last sweep around the property before heading back to their cruiser, leaving me with their card and a reminder to lock everything down tight. After they pulled away, the house felt colder than before, the kind of cold that sinks into the carpet and settles in the corners. I walked room to room, checking every window again, noticing tiny details I hadn't paid attention to earlier. A faint circle on the glass where a gloved thumb must have pressed. A thin line of melted snow on the inside of the back door frame. Somehow, those small traces felt worse than the noises themselves. They proved the person was confident enough to get right up against the house without hesitating, like they'd been there before, or at least practiced getting close. Sleeping that night wasn't an option. I sat on the couch with the living room lamp on, staring at the faded smear on the porch camera feed as it slowly cleared in the cold. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me that the camera wasn't smashed or disabled. It was just covered. Someone wanted me blinded, but not alerted. I kept imagining a hand reaching toward the lens, palm first, moving slowly enough for the warmth of the skin to leave streaks across the glass. Maybe they wiped it clean on their clothing afterward. Maybe they didn't care if I saw their handprint. Either way, the idea of someone being inches from my face, separated only by a tiny camera, made it impossible to shake the uneasy buzzing beneath my ribs. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside to take a better look at the footprints before they disappeared under fresh snowfall. The pattern confirmed exactly what the officers had said. The tracks circled the house in one long, looping trail, doubling back at certain windows like the person had returned to them more than once. What shook me most was how deep the prints were near the porch camera. Whoever stood there had lingered long enough to compress the snow down to a hard, icy ring. The tire marks on the road were still visible too. They ran parallel to the property, stopping right at the point where the tracks began, like the car had been sitting there for hours with a perfect view of my bedroom and living room windows. Since that night, nothing else has happened, and no one was ever identified. The police chalked it up to someone trying random houses because of the holiday travel season, but that explanation doesn't sit right with me. The person outside wasn't guessing. They moved with intention, checking the exact points where my house was most vulnerable. I replaced the camera the next day, added more lights, reinforced the basement hatch. But the thing that sticks with me most is the quiet moment when the footsteps paused directly beneath my bedroom. It felt like they were listening, maybe for me, maybe for movement, maybe for something I'll never understand. The only comfort I've found since then is that they left after that single night, and for reasons I hope never to learn, they didn't decide to come back. That December had been one of those months where everything felt packed and noisy. School deadlines, holiday plans, friends trying to squeeze in hangouts before everyone scattered. I'd gone to my friend Talia's house that evening to finish a history project and decompress a little. Her place sat a few blocks from mine, close enough that my parents didn't mind me walking as long as I texted updates. I remember leaving her porch with this mix of relief and tiredness, the kind that settles behind your eyes after a long day. The air had that prickly winter bite, and every breath came out in soft white clouds that drifted sideways with the wind. Streetlights hummed overhead, casting yellowish halos on the pavement. I pulled my hoodie tighter and kept moving, half lost in thoughts about finals, totally unaware of how fast that night was about to turn strange. The first sign that something wasn't right came from behind me. A quiet engine creeping along at a pace so slow it didn't fit the usual traffic on that street. I remember thinking it might be someone looking for an address, but the van kept matching my steps. When it rolled closer, I noticed the paint was a dull, uneven gray, the kind that looked hand-sprayed, almost chalky under the streetlight. The passenger window slid down just a few inches at first, and then all the way. A man with a round face and a scruffy jaw leaned out. His eyes had this unsettled darting pattern, like he was scanning for something beyond me. He asked where I lived, then said he could give me a lift before I froze out here, dragging the words like he practiced them. Something in the tone, flat but expectant, made me speed up. The van didn't peel off or yell anything. It just slowed even more, as if waiting for me to slip, hesitate, or get close enough to grab. I cut sharply across a yard I knew wasn't fenced, hopped down the other side, and bolted toward a side street that had a row of holiday lights blinking on a balcony. When I glanced back, the van had turned the opposite way, which almost confused me. Maybe they gave up? But that flicker of relief vanished fast when another vehicle, a dark compact car with a loud rattling muffler, entered the street from the far end. It drove past me once, then again, then a third time, this time slower. The windows weren't tinted, but the people inside kept their faces angled downward, only lifting their heads when they reached each corner, like they were trying not to be noticed yet searching at the same time. My house was still several blocks away, and the street I was on suddenly felt too open, too exposed. I ducked into the back lot of a small shop that had closed hours earlier, its metal security gate pulled down and locked. A big green dumpster sat wedged between the building and a brick wall, and I squeezed behind it, crouching low on the cold concrete. The sounds around me sharpened, the hum of the streetlight above, the crunch of gravel under car tires, and then the car stopping nearby. Doors slammed. I heard footsteps entering the alley, slow and deliberate. A beam of light cut across the ground, then swept upward along the brick wall. Another beam joined it. One of the men called out, his voice echoing slightly, asking where the girl in the hoodie went. Hearing that exact phrase sent a jolt through me. There was no way it was coincidence. They weren't just looking for someone. They were looking for me. The men didn't rush or stumble around like people who were confused or angry. Their movements had this unnerving confidence, like they already knew the layout of the alley and just needed to narrow down the hiding spots. One of them had a flashlight fitted with a long, narrow beam that sliced clean lines across the pavement. The other used a wider, bluish light that made the bricks glow faintly. They whispered to each other in short bursts, not enough for me to understand, but enough to tell they weren't improvising. At one point, the man with the narrow flashlight tapped the dumpster with his knuckles, 3 quick knocks, before sweeping the beam behind it. I pressed myself as small as I could, pulling my hood forward to cover the small patch of hair that wasn't hidden. The beam passed so close to my shoes that the rubber on the toes lit up. For a few seconds, all I could hear was my own breathing and the soft, static sound of their footsteps moving farther down the alley. Then one of them said something that tightened every muscle in my body. "Check behind the pallets next." There were wooden pallets stacked near the back door of the shop, and from where I was, I could see the gap between them and the wall. If they searched there and didn't find anything, it meant their next logical step would be to backtrack, straight toward the dumpster. I caught a glimpse of one of the flashlights reflecting off a window above me, and that faint, distorted reflection made everything feel unreal, like I was watching myself from another angle. I remember gripping the edge of the dumpster with my hand and feeling tiny chips of paint flaking under my fingers. Just as their steps circled closer again, a distant siren echoed from the main road. It wasn't close enough to be alarming, but close enough that the men paused. One of them muttered something sharp and irritated, and the other swung his light toward the street as if checking for patrol cars. The siren grew louder for a moment before fading, but the timing was enough to throw them off. They began retreating toward their car, still alert, still scanning the shadows, but now with this uneasy hurry in their walk. When they reached the mouth of the alley, the car headlights flicked on, briefly illuminating the brick walls in harsh white. The vehicle rolled slowly down the block, the occupants staring out both sides of the windows one last time before turning the corner. I stayed crouched behind the dumpster much longer than I probably needed to, aware that the cold from the concrete had started creeping through my jeans. My legs kept tensing and relaxing on their own, like my body couldn't decide whether to run or stay frozen in place. When I finally stood up, the world felt too quiet. No cars passing, no people walking dogs, not even the usual wind rattling the loose gutter above the shop. I peeked around the corner of the building toward the street and saw nothing but an empty intersection, the crosswalk light blinking its red hand slowly, over and over. I knew I had only a small window of safety, so I slipped out of the lot and took the back route home, cutting through yards and narrow paths I hadn't walked in years because they were always too dim. That night, they felt like the safest options I had. By the time I reached my street, the cold had settled deep into my clothes, but I barely registered it. What I kept replaying instead was the way the men had used my hoodie as a descriptor, like they'd already been watching before the van even showed up. My house came into view between two leafless trees, their branches stretching across the front yard like thin arms. One window on the second floor glowed faintly. My mom always left a lamp on when she knew I was walking home. That small patch of warm light hit me harder than I expected. I hurried up the porch steps, unlocked the door as quietly as I could, and slipped inside. The house smelled like cinnamon tea and old wood, familiar and grounding, but my nerves were still strung tight enough that every creak felt amplified. I didn't tell my parents right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because something about the whole encounter felt surreal. Like if I started talking too quickly, I'd jumble the details or sound dramatic. I went straight to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and tried to slow my breathing. From my window, I could see the faint glow of the street lamp outside and a slice of the sidewalk. For a long time, I watched that empty patch of pavement, half expecting something to turn the corner again. My phone buzzed with a message from Talia asking if I'd gotten home. I remember typing, "Yeah, all good," even though I didn't feel steady at all. Part of me was worried that saying what happened out loud would make it more real. The next morning, the local news ran a segment that made everything snap into place. A reporter stood outside a shopping center decorated with plastic reindeer and garlands, talking about an investigation into an organized group targeting young women walking alone after dark. They mentioned unmarked vans, mismatched license plates, multiple coordinated vehicles, and suspects using holiday crowds and early sunsets as cover. I sat on the couch staring at the screen while the reporter listed streets only a few blocks from where I'd been the night before. When she said law enforcement had disrupted part of the operation, but were looking for more individuals who fled, a chill threaded through me. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet understanding that the men searching that alley hadn't been random predators. They were part of something bigger, something deliberate. Later that day, I finally told my parents everything. My mom listened with this silent intensity, her hand covering her mouth. My dad kept asking for small details, positions of cars, which direction the van came from, how many voices I heard, like he could reconstruct the entire night if he gathered enough pieces. They contacted the police, who took the report seriously, but admitted they were already overwhelmed with similar tips. Still, an officer assured us they had patrols circling the area more frequently. For weeks afterward, I stuck to well-lit routes, refused to walk alone after dark, and avoided the alley behind the shop entirely. Even now, years later, when I hear a slow vehicle crawling along a quiet street, something in me tightens for a moment before logic catches up. I never learned who those men were or how long they'd been watching the neighborhood, but I know this much. If I hadn't trusted that first flicker of instinct, I might not have made it home at all.